Hey guys, tonight we're heading into the shadowy candlelit halls of the Middle Ages, where beauty wasn't just about looks, it was about status, survival, and sometimes a little suffering. You might think your skincare routine is intense, but back then people were bleaching their skin with lead, rubbing mercury on their faces, and plucking their hairlines halfway to the crown just to meet society's expectations. And honestly, you probably won't survive this. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me, where are you watching from tonight? What time is it in your corner of the world? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We begin with a face so pale it could haunt a painting. In medieval Europe, beauty was wrapped up in ideas of class and cleanliness, and nothing screamed upper class louder than lily-white skin. This wasn't just about looking fair, it was about looking untouched by the sun, by labour, by anything remotely peasanty. If your face had even a hint of a tan, people might assume you'd been working outside, like some kind of farmer. Ooh, the paler you looked, the richer you seemed. This wasn't about health, not really, it was about contrast. You were supposed to look like you spent your days lounging inside stone walls wrapped in velvet, nibbling on figs, not hauling sacks of grain or mucking out stalls. And while some people naturally had lighter skin, many others went to creative lengths to achieve the look. Enter the terrifying world of medieval cosmetics. One popular concoction for skin lightening involved lead carbonate. Yes, lead, mixed with vinegar. People would carefully smear it over their faces day after day, even though it slowly poisoned them. Side effects included hair loss, skin corrosion, and eventual death. But hey, at least you looked rich. Others tried slightly less deadly options, like bathing in donkey milk or applying ground-up lily root mixed with honey. There were recipes passed down through noble families, many of which included animal fat, crushed pearls and egg whites. If it could be smeared or soaked into your face, someone tried it. This obsession with paleness wasn't just cosmetic, it was moral. Religious art and literature often painted purity in tones of white. The Virgin Mary, the ultimate role model for women, was usually depicted with glowing, unblemished ivory skin. To be pale was to be virtuous. To be tanned? Well, that hinted at lust, sin, or just plain lower-class scandal. And then there were the goth girls of the 14th century, who took the pale trend to the next level. They powdered their faces to the point of looking corpse-like. Imagine walking around with a matte white mask, dark circles under your eyes, not from stress, but from actual belladonna drops used to dilate pupils and make your gaze more inviting. That wide-eyed, dazed stare, totally in vogue. Of course, not everyone agreed on what kind of pale was best. Some poets wrote about the rosy fairness of their muses, hinting that a touch of blush was desirable, while others praised a cold, moonlit beauty that made their heroines sound more like well-dressed phantoms than actual women. Scholars today still debate whether these extreme beauty ideals were widespread or mostly aspirational, more about fantasy than day-to-day life. After all, most people couldn't afford powdered pearls or imported lily balm. They were just trying not to die of dysentery. But records do show that among the nobility, women, and yes, sometimes men, really were altering their appearances in sometimes dangerous ways. Portraits from the period are suspiciously uniform. Pale faces, smooth skin, delicate hands. And that's no accident. Nobles were commissioning artists to capture them in their ideal light, even if that meant fudging a few features or smoothing out a smallpox scar. One lesser-known fact: some medieval physicians actually prescribed paleness. If you were flushed or had any natural redness in your skin, you might be diagnosed with an imbalance of humours, specifically too much blood or choler. Treatments, bloodletting, herbal purges, and, if that didn't work, a good old face mask made from crushed leeches. Yeah, you read that right. But even this idea of pale looks beautiful wasn't exactly universal across all of Europe. In Moorish Spain and certain Byzantine circles, olive skin and darker complexions were celebrated in poetry and song. A beautiful woman might be described as radiant as dusk, or compared to amber, cinnamon, or ripe dates. So while the Western European nobility leaned hard into the pale trend, there were places, especially where Islamic and Christian cultures overlapped, where other beauty ideals thrived. It's also worth noting that this obsession with light skin came with a side dish of classism that stuck around for centuries. Tans were a visual code for peasantry, fieldwork, poverty. People didn't just avoid the sun, they feared what it would say about them. Wealthy women used parasols, wide hats, and veils to protect their skin. Some even carried tiny folding fans with mirrors built in, so they could check for any offensive colour returning to their cheeks during the day. And if all else failed, a little artistic flair helped. Some noble women would paint pale lines down the centre of their legs and arms to make them appear whiter in candlelight. There are even accounts of people whitening their hands and then keeping them gloved for hours just to set the tone. Gloved hands were also a thing of elegance. Long fingers, smooth knuckles, unblemished skin, the kind of hands that never worked a day in their life. So next time you're stressed about a breakout or uneven skin tone, just remember, people once risked mercury poisoning just to look like a sickly ghost. That apparently was the look. Let's move slightly northward, up the face, to one of the strangest beauty trends in medieval Europe, the forehead obsession. Now, this wasn't just a passing fancy or an aristocratic quirk. No, this was full-on cultural commitment to the idea that the higher your forehead, the hotter you were. And no, we're not talking about metaphorical high-mindedness here. We're talking about actual square inches of exposed skin between your eyebrows and your scalp. In medieval Europe, especially during the late Middle Ages and early Renaissance, a lofty forehead wasn't just a marker of beauty. It was considered the very seat of intelligence and nobility. Which sounds nice, until you find out what people did to get one. Plucking, tweezing, threading, whatever primitive tool they had access to, they used it to rip hair out of their natural hairline, inch by painful inch. Some went even further and used lime-based creams to burn the hair off for a smoother result, even if that sometimes meant, well, chemical burns and bald spots. So there you are, staring at your reflection in a polished piece of bronze, or maybe a bowl of still water, counting backward from your natural hairline. 1 row of hair, 2 rows, maybe even 3, gone, completely gone. The higher your forehead looked, the more refined and ethereal you appeared. This wasn't just vanity, it was virtue. The ideal woman of the time was often painted with an exaggerated, serene face, framed by a wide, high brow. Her expression was calm, wise, and a little vacant, like she had just floated in from a dream, or maybe passed through a thick veil of incense. Take a walk through an art museum with a medieval wing and you'll see it. Those elegant portraits of queens and noble ladies with ghostly pale skin, smooth hairlines pulled up halfway to their scalps, and long thin faces that look like they were engineered for silent contemplation. You can't help but wonder how much of this trend was driven by religious iconography. Paintings of the Virgin Mary often showed her with that same high brow, her forehead wide and clear, as if her divine knowledge had to be housed in visibly larger cranial real estate. Artists weren't exactly going for realism, they were echoing ideals, and the women who saw those paintings knew it. They were literally ripping out hair to look like saints. Even weirder, the eyebrows got caught in the crossfire. In some regions and periods, they were plucked out completely, just erased. Zip, nothing above the eyes. Other times the style was to thin them so drastically they looked like 2 soft commas above an endless expanse of forehead. Again, the idea was to keep the face clean, smooth and ethereal. Anything too bold, too sharp, well, that suggested wildness, unrestrained passion, and medieval society, particularly in upper-class Christian circles, was all about self-control, modesty and delicate restraint. Even your eyebrows had to behave. There's actually a famous court case from 14th century England where a nobleman described his estranged wife as grotesque, citing her man-like brows and unplucked forehead as evidence of her decline in beauty. Talk about a low blow, but it also shows how serious this was. Beauty wasn't just personal, it was political. If your forehead looked too low or your brows too thick, people didn't just think you were unfashionable, they questioned your morality, your breeding, even your sanity. And of course not everyone agreed on this highbrow standard. In parts of Italy, particularly in more rural areas, the trend didn't catch on as strongly. Some scholars argue that these beauty ideals were mostly upheld in courtly circles, nobles trying to one-up each other with increasingly bizarre grooming rituals, while regular people were too busy surviving to worry about the distance between their brows and their hairline. But art and literature from the time suggest the influence of the nobility trickled down more than you'd think. When noble women start plucking their foreheads, their attendants often followed suit. and those attendants went home and shared tips with their sisters and cousins and neighbours. Before long, the village might have more high brows than highborns. Let's not skip over the gender side of this. While women bore the brunt of the beauty pressure, noblemen weren't immune. Men too were known to pluck their foreheads, albeit less drastically. A smooth high forehead suggested intelligence and control, traits desirable in men, especially those trying to climb the courtly ladder. One French nobleman reportedly ordered his portrait retouched to give him a nobler brow. Imagine trying to explain to your portrait artist that your face just didn't say power the way you wanted it to. And here's where it gets even stranger. People believed the forehead was a window into your character. Early physiognomy, the now debunked practice of reading people's personalities based on facial features, was already a thing. A wide open forehead? That meant clarity, virtue and wisdom. A low sloping brow that hinted at deceit, lust or even madness. It wasn't just aesthetics, it was psychological profiling via plucking. One fringe belief even claimed that the size of the forehead could affect a person's soul. Some monks argued that a high, clean forehead made it easier for divine inspiration to enter the mind, which frankly feels like the medieval version of putting crystals on your third eye. There's no evidence this was mainstream theology, but it pops up in odd places. Sermons, private letters, even some bizarrely detailed medical treatises. Naturally, not everyone was on board with the look. Some satirical writers mocked high foreheads as ridiculous and vain, likening noble women to shaved sheep or overstirred dolls. One 15th century poem pokes fun at women who pluck their pates till their thoughts fly out, suggesting that some people found the trend as baffling as we do today. Still, the power of the beauty standard held strong. If everyone in your social circle was doing it, and your prospects for marriage, influence, and reputation depended on how you looked, wouldn't you reach for the tweezers too? Even if they were basically two sticks tied together? So the next time you're annoyed by your own brows, or maybe tempted to raise your hairline with some modern contouring, just remember, somewhere in a cold, drafty stone chamber, a medieval lady was sitting on a stool by candlelight, carefully yanking out her hair by the root, all in the hope of being seen as beautiful, virtuous and worth marrying. Beauty has always been pain, in this case follicle-level trauma pain. Alright, so you've plucked your forehead into oblivion, the front row of your scalp is now property of the highbrow society, and you're feeling pretty smug about it. But wait, there's more. We need to talk about eyebrows, or rather the complete lack of them. You wouldn't know it scrolling through today's social media where eyebrows have their own cult following, sculpted, laminated, shaded, and fussed over like prized bonsai trees. But in the medieval period, eyebrows were at best tolerated. At worst, they were suspicious little caterpillars that needed to be eradicated. Thin was in, non-existent was better. Some medieval women didn't just thin their eyebrows, they removed them entirely right down to the last faint little hair. The look was ghostly and to us now a little alarming. A smooth, expressionless canvas stretching from lash line to scalp, like a porcelain doll that's seen too much. But back then, that blankness was elegance. It was purity, and it told the world you weren't some wild creature ruled by emotion. You were demure, modest, fully in control of your feelings, and your tweezers. In fact, having bushy eyebrows was sometimes associated with unrefined or even beastly traits. Think about it. Medieval bestiaries, those wild illustrated books of animals, real and imagined, often depicted demons or wild women with thick, unruly brows. The further you were from that, the more civilized you appeared. So shaving them off wasn't just aesthetic, it was symbolic. Interestingly, there are also written accounts that link the removal of brows to religious piety. Some devout women removed all facial hair, including brows and lashes, to separate themselves from vanity. The thinking was, beauty draws attention and attention draws sin. But irony alert, by removing the brows they were also aligning themselves with courtly beauty standards, so somewhere between spiritual humility and high fashion conformity, the line got very blurry. Now not everyone walked around looking like a browless alien. In fact, just like today, there were regional differences and class variations. Among the upper classes in France and England, plucked brows were all the rage from the 12th through to the 15th centuries. But in places like Spain or certain parts of Italy, darker, thicker brows stuck around longer, partly because of cultural mixing with Arab traditions, where bold features were more celebrated. There's also the issue of practicality. Removing your eyebrows in a world without mirrors, or at least not the kind that we're used to, was risky business. A wrong move, and suddenly your refined expression turned into a permanently surprised ghost face. Some women used polished metal mirrors or relied on handmaidens to help them achieve the right look. Eyebrow grooming wasn't a solo sport, it was often a team effort and a status symbol. One fringe practice involved singeing the brows off with a tiny heated rod, a method borrowed from certain Middle Eastern grooming techniques. Effective? Sure. Terrifying? Also yes. People described the faint scent of burned hair during grooming sessions as the smell of virtue. That's dedication right there. Of course, what happens when trends change, or your brows start to grow back? That's when the first signs of cosmetic pencil use begin to pop up in the historical record. Crushed berries, charcoal, or soot mixed with oil were used to gently shade in a faint brow when the bare look fell out of favour, or when a little facial framing was needed for a portrait or feast. But again, only very lightly. Overdo it, and you risked being seen as vain or, worse, a practitioner of the dark arts. Which brings us to the awkward conversation of the church and cosmetics. While the church didn't have an official eyebrow doctrine, thankfully, it did have strong opinions on altering your God-given appearance, especially if that involved cosmetics that veered into deception. The idea was that to change your appearance too much was to challenge divine authority. You were, in essence, saying God had made a mistake. And if that wasn't dangerous enough, wearing makeup could make you look like a temptress. Another major no-no. This meant that a totally bare face, devoid of obvious makeup or strong features, was safest. A smooth forehead, invisible brows, downcast eyes. That was the medieval trifecta of piety and prettiness. You weren't just beautiful, you were spiritually disciplined. Still, not everyone agreed on the Browless ideal. Some male writers of the period, especially in the court scene, grumbled that the trend made women look unnatural or too distant. They longed for the lively expressions of older times. In a few love poems, you can even find men praising their lovers' eyebrows, curved like the wings of swallows, or dark as midnight ink. So clearly not everyone was on the same brow page, and there's still scholarly debate about how widespread these extreme grooming practices really were. Some argue that we're putting too much weight on artistic depictions and literary metaphors. Just because a portrait shows a woman with no eyebrows doesn't mean she actually plucked them off in real life. It might have been artistic shorthand for virtue, like a medieval Instagram filter. Others point to medical texts and personal letters that mention hair removal explicitly, suggesting this was more than just art, it was daily reality, at least for the upper crust. The fringe fact? There are recipes in medieval beauty manuals, yes, those existed, for brow thinning ointments. One particularly unsettling mixture includes vinegar, ant eggs, and burnt alum. Apply it nightly and voila, goodbye brows. Whether it worked or just burned your face off is up for debate, but someone was out there smearing ant egg paste on their forehead in the name of beauty. You also had brow shadowing, described in a few Persian-influenced beauty scrolls that made their way westward via trade routes. These mentioned using kohl for defining the brows, ironically the exact opposite of what Western Europeans were doing. So while one side of the world was enhancing the brows, the other was erasing them. Proof that beauty, as always, is deeply local, and deeply weird. And like all trends, the tide eventually turned. By the time we roll into the 16th century, brows start creeping back into fashion, gently arched and softly penciled. But during the high medieval period, having brows was a liability, not a flex. Women went through a great deal of effort and pain to maintain that blank, ethereal look, hoping that every pluck would bring them closer to beauty, to virtue, or maybe just to a better marriage proposal. So next time you're annoyed with your tweezers or stressing over that one rogue brow hair that refuses to cooperate, just remember, medieval ladies were setting their face on varm and rubbing bug juice on their foreheads to get the look. Suddenly your brow pencil doesn't seem so bad. Now that you've shaved your brows into oblivion and plucked your hairline to kingdom come, it's time to bring some colour back to your face. Specifically, those carefully flushed cheeks. Because if there's one thing a medieval lady couldn't afford to look like, it was alive. But also not too dead. Welcome to the tightrope walk that was medieval rouge culture. Here's the paradox. A healthy, natural flush was considered attractive, but naturalness itself was suspicious. Too much colour? You might be indulging in forbidden pleasures. Too little? You might be on death's door, or worse, working outside. So what's a girl to do? Fake it. But do it so subtly no one can prove you're faking it. Rouge was a big deal in court circles, especially during the later Middle Ages, when beauty rituals started levelling up. Cheek colour had to look like a shy blush, not a full-on fever. The trick was to seem like you were naturally delicate and fresh-faced, as if you just stepped out of a chapel, not a makeup session. In fact, some beauty manuals from the time suggest applying just enough red to mimic the rosiness of modesty. That's right, your cheeks needed to lie for you. One popular blend involved grinding up red ochre, basically coloured clay, and mixing it with animal fat or egg white to create a sticky paste. For those with deeper pockets, crushed cochineal, that's powdered beetles, yes, actual beetles, or imported safflower petals offered a richer, longer-lasting tint. You dab it on with a cloth or even a little bit of sponge if you were fancy. But only a little. The whole point was subtlety. Too much, and suddenly you weren't modest, you were vain, or worse, French. And let's be real, medieval France was often the designated scapegoat for beauty excesses. English clerics would regularly gripe about painted French women who dared to flaunt rouge and eyeliner. French women, meanwhile, accused the English of having the faces of potatoes. Beauty snark was truly international. But beneath the banter, there were deeper fears. Applying colour to your face, especially red, flirted with the dangerous territory of lust. In medieval Christian culture, red was the colour of sin, temptation, blood, and the devil. So there's this bizarre tension. You had to look healthy, youthful and pleasing, but not seductive. Which is a bit like being told to walk into a room glowing, but without attracting attention. Good luck with that. To avoid suspicion, some women claimed their colour came from more natural sources, like brisk walks in the garden, or standing near a fire, or even from the blessings of a particularly intense prayer session. Imagine someone complimenting your rosy cheeks and you being like, "Thank you, it's divine intervention." But let's not pretend everyone was subtle. In some royal courts, especially during festivals or masquerades, rouge use went wild. There are accounts of women slathering on thick layers of carmine and dusting it with white powder to achieve a dramatic doll-like look. One chronicler from Burgundy snidely described the Queen's ladies as having the cheeks of roasted apples and the morals of tavern girls. Bit harsh, but you get the idea. Interestingly, some men joined in too. A well-groomed courtier might apply a dab of red to his cheeks to suggest vigour and youth. It was subtle, and often mocked, but it happened. In the later 15th century, a few fashion-forward dukes were rumoured to have their own rouge pots, hidden in private chambers, guarded more closely than their prayer books. Fringe fact for you, there was a belief among some physicians that rubbing your cheeks with nettle leaves or garlic could bring natural colour to the face. The logic? Mild skin irritation brings blood to the surface, giving you a temporary flush, which, yes, is basically inflammation. So if you couldn't afford rouge or didn't want to get caught using it, you could just sting yourself into looking alive. There was even a medieval debate about where exactly the rouge should go. Some beauty guides suggest applying it to the apples of the cheeks only to mimic innocent youth. Others recommend a more vertical stroke along the cheekbone said to elongate the face and make it look more angelic. And one Italian court physician wrote that too much colour near the nose was the mark of a drunkard. The pressure was real, and this wasn't just about aesthetics. In a world where mirrors were rare and photography didn't exist, your face was your resume. It told people who you were, what class you belonged to, whether you were marriageable or morally suspect. A face too pale suggested illness or poverty. A face too red implied lust or intoxication. The perfect flush? It said, "I'm pure, but not boring, delicate, but not dead." But let's pause for a second, because the bigger question here is, who decided this was beautiful? Was it women shaping their own standards in noble courts? Was it artists and poets pushing pale, blushing muses as their ideal? Was it the church mixing virtue with visual cues? Scholars still debate it. Some say the fashion came from above, royalty setting the standard. Others argue it bubbled up from folk traditions, where red cheeks were linked to fertility and warmth. Still others think it was about survival. Looking young and healthy helped secure marriage, and marriage was survival. And then there's art. In illuminated manuscripts and early portraiture, you start to see the same faces repeated. Milk-white skin, soft rose-petal cheeks, expression calm and inward. It wasn't realism, it was a vibe, a cultural mood board. The goal wasn't to look like yourself, it was to look like someone else, someone ideal, elevated, almost untouchable. So, if you're imagining a noble woman in her chamber, perched on a stool, smoothing egg-white paste across her cheeks while muttering a prayer for modest beauty, you're not far off. She's probably using a polished brass mirror, checking her reflection by candlelight, trying to strike the impossible balance between virtue and attraction. And if you think this only applied to women, think again. There were beauty expectations for men too, more on that later, but a youthful flush was just as desirable on their side of the gender divide, especially if they were expected to woo, perform, or lead in courtly games of flirtation and status. So tonight, when you pass your own mirror, maybe pause and give your cheeks a gentle poke, not for vanity's sake, but as a little nod to the long, strange history of people painting life onto their faces, hoping to be noticed, hoping not to be noticed, and always trying to look just alive enough to get by. All right, we've handled your forehead, brows and cheeks, so let's talk about what may have been the single biggest flex in medieval beauty: your hair. Specifically long, flowing, impossibly well-kept hair that looked like it had never encountered hard labour, lice, or the business end of a pair of shears. In the medieval imagination, the hair wasn't just hair, it was a symbol, a statement. For women, it was a tapestry of virtue, sensuality, and social standing all knotted up into one very high-maintenance package. And the rules? Oh, there were rules. First, no, the longer the better. Short hair on a woman? Scandalous, reserved for nuns, widows, or those who had committed some grievous moral crime. In some cases, cutting off a woman's hair was used as punishment. Not a haircut, a sentence. But if you were playing the courtly game, you let that hair grow like your life depended on it. And maybe, in a way, it did. Hair was considered a crowning glory, a literal halo of desirability. Literature from the time is dripping with verses about golden strands, raven black braids, and tresses so long they swept the floor. If a poet didn't compare your hair to sunlight or silk, or some kind of divine wheat field, were you even trying? Here's the kicker though, you weren't actually supposed to show it. That's right, this massive symbol of beauty, this magnet for romantic attention and high praise, covered, hidden, mostly off limits. Once a girl reached puberty or got married, often both, her hair was veiled, bound, braided, or wrapped under elaborate headgear like a wimple or a crespine. Showing off loose hair in public was considered provocative, sometimes even sinful. It was reserved for private spaces, like your bedchamber, or symbolic appearances, such as weddings or religious ceremonies. So medieval women lived in this paradox where their most prized feature was also the most concealed. But that just added to the mystery, honestly. If you let your hair down, literally, you were either making a bold statement or very, very alone. The sight of a lady brushing her hair in private was considered one of the most sensual images imaginable. Painters in the late medieval period loved to show this moment. A noble woman in a loose gown, her hair falling over her shoulders like a waterfall framed in candlelight. It wasn't just aesthetics, it was intimacy. Now let's talk texture. The ideal hair type was soft, shiny, and gently wavy. Straight hair was considered less interesting, and very curly hair could be seen as unruly, or even a sign of a wild nature, especially in men, oddly enough. And while natural hair colours varied widely across Europe, there was one tone that ruled the courts: blonde. Blonde hair was considered the height of beauty in many medieval courts, particularly in France, England, and Italy. It was linked to youth, light, purity, and no surprise here, the Virgin Mary, who was often painted as fair-haired, even though that was artistically unlikely given her actual historical geography. Blonde hair wasn't super common, which made it even more prized. If you were lucky enough to have it naturally, congratulations, you were already halfway to goddess status. But if you weren't, oh, don't worry, there were solutions. One fringe method to lighten hair involved a mixture of saffron, alum, and lie left to sit in the sun. Women would slather this golden paste into their hair, then sit for hours under UV rays, hoping to coax out a few golden highlights. Others used vinegar rinses followed by lemon juice, again paired with sun exposure. And the most dedicated? They used urine. That's right, aged urine, left out to ferment, then applied to the scalp in the name of beauty. It had ammonia. It worked. It also smelled exactly like you think it did. And here's the thing. Hair wasn't just about the strands, it was about the style. Medieval hairstyles were intricate affairs, especially for the upper class. We're talking braids looped and pinned into heart shapes, beaded nets with pearl embroidery, ribbons and lace laced through coils. If you had ladies in waiting or servants, they'd help you achieve your daily masterpiece. And for special occasions, hair got architectural. There were cone-shaped hennins, the pointy princess hats you've seen in fairy tales, sometimes several feet high with gauzy veils cascading down. No one wore that to run errands. It was pure pageantry. Of course, all of this effort came with its own hazards. Lice were a very real problem. Washing hair was rare. Too much water was thought to upset the balance of humours, so instead, people used scented powders or herbal rinses to keep things fresh. Popular herbs included rosemary, lavender, and sage. Wealthy women might have little ivory combs to work through their hair while chatting with other noble ladies, grooming as social ritual. And let's not forget the gender side of this equation. Men's hair was also carefully policed by fashion and status, but they got a little more freedom to show it off. Long hair on men was acceptable, especially for knights or noblemen, but it had to be clean, orderly, and ideally not more luxurious than a woman's. If your hair started to look too fabulous, you might be accused of vanity or worse, trying to act above your station. Sound familiar? Even monks got dragged into the hair drama. The classic monk tonsure, the shaved circle on top with fringe around the sides, was a visible sign of piety, but it was also mocked in popular culture. People joked that you could tell a monk's sins by how wide his bald patch was. Fringe fact, in some monasteries, they had actual stencils for shaving the perfect circle. Nothing says spiritual discipline like a well-shaped bald spot, and again, this whole obsession with hair was about more than looks. It was a cultural code. For women, loose hair could signal virginity or seduction depending on the context. Covered hair showed respectability, but also hinted at what was hidden beneath. Married women who wore their hair uncovered were accused of being unchaste. Meanwhile, widows were expected to keep it restrained, even covered in black, as a sign of mourning and detachment from worldly pleasures. So that if you were a medieval woman waking up in a stone manor house, your hair routine might go something like this. Gently detangle using an ivory or wooden comb. Apply a bit of herbal oil if you had it. Braid or twist it into a complicated style, maybe with ribbons. Secure it under a veil or a cap, and then spend the rest of the day pretending like your glowing, perfumed, floor-length locks weren't even a big deal. Just another Tuesday. All of this just to say medieval beauty standards were deeply tangled. Pun absolutely intended. Your hair could elevate you, define you, or even betray you. But for all the danger and discomfort, it also held power. In poems, in portraits, in whispered court gossip, hair was currency, and if you had it long, blonde, and veiled just enough to make someone wonder, you were winning. So you've grown your hair out to mythical lengths, endured herbal rinses, maybe even bathed it in a suspiciously pungent bucket of fermented urine, all in the hopes of channeling the shimmering golden aesthetic of a medieval goddess. But what if you weren't born with the colour of sunshine? What if your locks leaned more mousy than radiant? Don't worry, the medieval world had a solution for that too, just not one that your dermatologist would approve of. Blonde in medieval Europe wasn't just a colour, it was a social fantasy. Blondness suggested purity, nobility, even divinity, and from early church paintings of angelic hosts, the flaxen-haired heroines of courtly poetry, gold-toned hair carried a heavy halo of symbolism. In a sea of brunettes, which to be fair was the genetic norm across much of Europe, the rare blonde stood out as otherworldly. It was a biological lottery win, unless you were willing to cheat. And cheat they did. Medieval hair lightening was a dangerous game of patience, chemistry, and sun exposure. Women would smear all manner of strange potions into their hair, then camp out for hours in the sunshine, their heads tilted back, veils lifted, praying for those sacred golden tones to emerge. Think of it like a spa day, if the spa was on a rooftop, and your treatment smelled like a salad that had gone tragically wrong. The most common homemade bleach was a blend of saffron, honey, alum, and lye, all mixed into a paste and rubbed into the scalp. Lye, for those unfamiliar, is a caustic chemical also used in soap making, and while it could lighten hair, it could also burn straight through it if you weren't careful. Prolonged exposure could lead to dryness, brittleness, and, ironically, accidental bald spots. But beauty hurts, right? There are also records of women using ashes from burned grapevines or barley straw to create a sort of powder lightener. Mix that with goat's milk or vinegar, and you've got yourself a rustic bleach that promised golden highlights, along with a deeply vinegary scent that no amount of rosemary sprigs could quite mask. One popular technique was known as la chioma di sole, or the hair of the sun, practiced by Italian women, in the late medieval and early Renaissance periods. They would prepare their hair with a brightening solution, then wear wide-brimmed straw hats with the crown cut out, allowing only their hair to poke through the top. The face stayed shaded, but the hair got maximum sun exposure. It was part fashion, part sun lamp, and 100% commitment to the blonde agenda. And if the lightning treatments didn't work, or worked too well and fried your hair to a crisp, you always had the nuclear option: wigs. Or more specifically, hairpieces and extensions made from other women's hair, often from servants, sometimes from the dead. Yes, really. Locks were cleaned, treated, and stitched into nets or braids, then pinned discreetly under veils or hennins. It was a weirdly intimate kind of commerce, wearing someone else's hair, hoping no one noticed. Think of it as early medieval cosplay, where you borrowed someone else's genetics for an evening. Now, while blonde was the reigning trend, don't assume brunettes were totally out of luck. In some parts of Europe, particularly southern regions like Spain or certain areas of Italy, dark hair retained its own allure. It was linked to mystery, intellect, and passion. Moorish influence introduced new aesthetics that celebrated deep colours and sharp contrasts. Poets praised dark tresses like midnight silk, or compared them to raven feathers glistening with dew. So while the northern courts were worshipping golden goddesses, the south was still writing love letters to women with hair like storm clouds. Still, there was a persistent belief in many parts of Christendom that blonde hair was holier, and sometimes too blonde could look suspiciously angelic, which paradoxically was dangerous. The church, ever watchful of beauty crossing into vanity, sometimes raised an eyebrow at artificially enhanced blondes. There are sermons that warned against women who altered the Lord's design and stirred the minds of men to sin with their gilded locks. So what if your hair looked too good, it might get you side-eyed by a monk, or worse, become an object of temptation in the eyes of wandering knights. Here's your fringe fact: some women actually tried to tone their blonde hair with violet herbs or mashed up berries to achieve the right shade of gold. Not too yellow, not too orange, but the ethereal soft glow they called sunspun. Some even used blue wool soaked in water as a kind of medieval toner, brushing it gently through their hair in the hopes of cutting brassiness. If this sounds suspiciously like modern purple shampoo, yeah, humans have always been the same, haven't they? Of course, all of this was time-consuming, expensive, and high risk, which means that going blonde became a status symbol, not just because of its rarity, but because of the effort required to maintain it. Just like pale skin said, "I don't work outside," golden hair said, "I have the time and resources to sit in the sun for 6 hours with fermented flour paste on my scalp." It was visual shorthand for wealth. And then there were the accessories. Hair, once lightened, wasn't left to just hang there. It was staged. Noble women might weave gold threads or seed pearls through their braids to highlight the colour, or dust their hair with powdered silver to give it shimmer in candlelight. Special perfumes, called hair waters, were used to scent the strands with rose, cinnamon, or orange peel. If your hair passed someone in a corridor and left a fragrance trail, congratulations, you are now the human equivalent of a luxury brand. But not everyone was enchanted. Some writers mocked the effort, calling it the golden folly. One poet described a woman's hair as dyed by sin and scented by pride, accusing her of caring more about flaxen curls than Christian humility. There were even stories of women being rejected as wives because their hair was too clearly touched by Vilsemi, harsh. Still, the cultural obsession endured. Even today, when you think of a fairy tale princess, she's probably blonde, right? That's no accident. The medieval blonde ideal stuck around, carried forward by centuries of art, literature, and Disney. But back in the day, it was a labour-intensive identity. You didn't just have blonde hair, you became blonde with time, sunlight, and no small amount of bodily risk. So next time you reach for your purple shampoo or debate whether to go caramel or ash-toned, remember the women who came before you. Rooftop sunbathers with their saffron pastes praying for sunlight and not chemical burns. Blonde ambition, it's older than you think. Now that you're all glammed up from the scalp down, brows vanished, cheeks delicately flushed, hair kissed by sun and possibly a little bit of ammonia, it's time to take a quick look downward. Let's talk shoes, and not just any shoes. Let's talk about the tiny, pointy, wildly impractical footwear that dominated medieval fashion and somehow convinced people that mutilating your feet was the height of elegance. If you've ever seen illustrations or statues from the late Middle Ages, especially the 14th and 15th centuries, you've probably noticed the absurdly long shoes. These weren't just pointy, they were weaponized. These shoes, called poulaines or krakows, depending on who you ask and what century you're in, featured elongated toes that could stretch several inches, sometimes even over a foot past the actual foot. And no, they were not designed for walking. The poulaine craze started in Eastern Europe, hence the name Krakow, a nod to the Polish city, but quickly spread westward and took the courts by storm. Nobles in France, England, and the Holy Roman Empire began slipping their pampered feet into these cartoonishly extended shoes as a way to flaunt their status. Because here's the thing, you couldn't actually do anything useful in them. Walking was tricky. Running? Impossible. Working? Absolutely out of the question. Which made them perfect. The longer the toe, the higher your rank. There were even written complaints that you could basically measure a man's ego by the length of his shoe. Some pairs were so extended that the tips had to be tied to the wearer's shin, with little ribbons or gold-threaded cords, just so they didn't flop around like medieval clown shoes. You'd think people might draw the line there. They didn't. And yes, these shoes hurt. Not in that I've been standing all day way, but in the my toes are being slowly suffocated way. The narrow toe box forced the foot into an unnatural crunched position. Think of the modern stiletto, but with none of the padding and about 10 extra inches of liability sticking out the front. Bunions, corns, and ingrown toenails were all very much part of the deal. But hey, beauty is pain, right? Literally medieval foot-binding levels of pain in some cases. Interestingly, there's a surviving pair of poulaines in a museum in England with a toe nearly 24 inches long. That's not footwear, that's a trip hazard. And yet someone wore them, proudly, probably hobbling around some candlelit feast hall, leaving chaos in their wake. There's even evidence that people modified their gait to walk in these things. Contemporary writers describe a kind of dainty, swaying shuffle, more of a glide, really, that noblemen adopted when wearing extra long poulaines. The idea was that your movement should suggest grace and control, even while your shoes actively tried to kill you. It was like walking while balancing knives strapped to your toes. But again, it worked. You looked rich. The church, naturally, hated them. Sermons from the 14th century railed against the moral decay symbolised by absurdly long shoes. Some preachers claimed the devil had designed them himself and whispered the idea into the ears of sinful nobles. Others suggested that men who wore poulaines were effeminate or worldly, prioritising vanity over virtue, which, to be fair, wasn't entirely off the mark. Even royalty got dragged into the controversy. King Edward IV of England reportedly banned poulaines in 1463, stating that they were not only ridiculous but wasteful. The law limited the toe length to just 2 inches beyond the foot, hardly anything at all really, and of course nobody paid attention. Fashion scoffed at legislation then just as it does now. And here's your fringe fact. Some poulaines were so extreme that they curled upward at the tip like skis, a style that required tiny metal wires or even whalebone inserts to maintain the shape. You couldn't make it up if you tried. These curved versions were especially popular at court events, where people could show off their footwear without needing to, actually move much. For women, shoes were generally smaller and more delicate, though not much more comfortable. Wealthy women wore the silk or the velvet slippers with thin soles that provided almost no protection. Walking outside? Not unless you wanted your feet to melt into the mud. So if you did have to step beyond the cobblestone path of your manor, you strapped on pattens, basically wooden platforms worn under your slippers, like clunky medieval crocs, only with about 50% more risk of falling on your face. Pattens could raise you several inches above the filthy streets and were necessary unless you wanted to come home with mud, and worse, soaked into your hems. They were so noisy that sumptuary laws in some cities restricted their use indoors. That's right, people were too loud with their shoes, but just like poulaines, the point was never practicality. It was to prove you didn't need to walk anywhere fast or do anything physical. If your footwear made everyday life harder, it meant you had people to do things for you. Servants, grooms, carriage drivers, literal stool bearers to carry you over puddles. Impracticality was a flex. And then, of course, shoes became yet another tool in the class war. Laws began to regulate who could wear what kind of footwear. In England and France, sumptuary laws spelled out toe-length allowances by rank. Nobles got the full banana peel treatment. Merchants and artisans had to tone it down. Peasants, no pointy shoes for you. You got basic leather boots or rough sandals, often homemade and patched. There's even archaeological evidence that medieval peasants regularly wore through the soles of their shoes and patched them with scraps of old fabric or rope. Function over form. The toe box was wide, the fit loose, because walking, farming and surviving took priority over fashion statements. Still, even among the lower classes, you'd see occasional attempts to mimic courtly styles on a budget. A little extra taper at the toe, a dyed piece of leather. The dream of stylish shoes lives eternal. Though scholars still debate how much of the poulain craze was about gender performance versus class performance. Was the long toe about masculinity, claiming space, asserting dominance, or was it about being above manual labour and physical competence? Probably both. Some argue the shape was vaguely phallic, an unconscious bragging gesture. Others say it was just about peacocking. If your shoes got people talking, you'd done your job. Whatever the reason, these shoes left literal footprints on the medieval culture. And while they eventually fell out of fashion, thankfully, the lesson remains. When fashion becomes physically hostile to your body, you've probably crossed the line into high society. So next time your heels start aching or you find yourself questioning the wisdom of pointy-toed boots in winter, just remember, somewhere in 14th century France, a nobleman is tying the tips of his shoes to his knees, determined to look fabulous, even if it means falling flat on his richly embroidered face. Now, you've got your hair glossed and glowing, your cheeks delicately flushed, and you're teetering around in shoes that are more architectural hazard than footwear. But we're not done yet. Let's talk about the body, specifically how people in the Middle Ages tried to shape, conceal, and enhance it to match the ever-shifting ideal of the perfect silhouette. Spoiler, it did not involve Pilates, but it did involve a lot of fabric, lacing, and a serious tolerance for discomfort. First, let's get one thing straight. There was no such thing as a medieval corset in the way we think of it today. If you're picturing tight-laced, waist-snatching, steel-boned bodices, you're a few centuries early. But that doesn't mean medieval people weren't highly invested in shaping the human body. Oh no, they were absolutely playing the long game when it came to appearance, and doing it with layers. So, many layers. The medieval fashion formula went something like this. Start with a linen shift, basically a nightgown, then add a fitted underdress called a cotardy or kirtle. Over that, pile on a gown, surcoat, cloak, and if you were really going for it, a mantle. The result? A cascade of textiles that could make even the plainest figure look majestic, or if done poorly, like a walking tent. The goal for women was a long, willowy frame with a slightly rounded belly. Yes, a soft belly, get ready for that plot twist, and a narrow upper torso. To achieve this, the undergarments were key. The kirtle was often laced tightly at the sides or back, designed to smooth the waist and lift the bust subtly, without the violent compression we associate with later corsetry. It wasn't about suffocating curves into submission, it was about gently suggesting shape, like an oil painting in motion. And that belly? Believe it or not, in the high medieval period, a little tummy was in. It was seen as a sign of fertility, wealth, and good living. There are illuminated manuscripts where noblewomen are drawn with a distinct curve at the midsection, even when they're not pregnant. It gave them a soft, earthy elegance, like they just finished a very successful feast and were about to recite poetry in a garden. For men, the silhouette was all about broad shoulders, a narrow waist, and, depending on the century, a dramatic flare at the hips. Yes, you heard that right. Some men wore padded doublets and exaggerated tunics that flared out at the thigh, creating what one fashion historian calls the swagger of the rooster. Toss in a belt slung low around the hips, and you've got a peacocking nobleman strutting through the Great Hall like he owns the place, because he probably does. But not everyone got to play the shaping game equally. Like with all things medieval beauty, clothing that manipulated your body's appearance was tightly bound to class. The more fabric you wore, the higher your status. A peasant's wardrobe was usually practical, tight where it needed to be, loose everywhere else, designed for labour, not aesthetics. No one was lacing up their shift before a 12-hour day in the fields. Meanwhile, in courtly circles, fashion took full advantage of layers and illusion. Enter the sideless surcoat, also known as the window of hell, a nickname gifted to it by scandalised clerics. This dramatic outer garment had wide armholes that extended all the way down to the hips, exposing the fitted gown beneath. When worn correctly, it turned the female body into a kind of walking hourglass. It was flirtation by omission. Nothing scandalous actually showed, but the structure of the garment hinted at everything underneath. Church officials, naturally, lost their collective minds over it. And this is where fashion started dipping into morality again. Just like with makeup, there were sermons and texts condemning garments that altered the natural figure too much. One preacher warned that ladies who sew false curves into their gowns shall find their souls misshapen before God. A little dramatic, sure, but not unusual. In medieval Europe, changing your outward appearance was always playing with fire, but of course people played anyway. That's where things get juicy. Let's talk belts. These were not just functional accessories, they were instruments of illusion. Worn just under the bust, they created the illusion of a high, narrow waist and an elongated lower torso. Some belts were delicately jewelled, meant to draw the eye downward, elongating the figure. Others were made of heavy leather and hung with charms or purses. Either way, they were more than accessories. They were body shapers. Now, here's a fringe fact for you. Some noble women wore padded rolls under their gowns to create rounder hips and a fuller rear. Yes, centuries before the bustle or the modern shapewear industry came along. These little cushions were tied around the waist and gave the illusion of fertility and abundance, two traits medieval society loved to obsess over. Basically, the early prototype of the hip enhancer. For men, there were similarly absurd inventions. One of the most infamous was the codpiece, a padded, often ridiculously exaggerated pouch worn over the groin. While it didn't appear until the late medieval period, it grew quickly in size and theatricality. Early versions were just fabric flaps designed for practicality, but fashion quickly turned them into statements of virility. Think of it as medieval manspreading in cloth form. And while today's fashion tends to romanticize symmetry, medieval people didn't mind a bit of asymmetry in their silhouettes. One shoulder exposed by a falling gown strap. That was mysterious. A slightly off-centre belt. Casual elegance. You didn't want to look like you were trying too hard, even if you'd spent an hour being sewn into your underdress. Scholars still debate how realistic these body ideals were for most people. Were the portraits and poetry exaggerations, or did noble women really go to such lengths to sculpt their figures through layering and lacing? Archaeological finds of garments suggest that at least among the wealthy, these ideals were very real, and with enough fabric, padding and patience, you could make yourself look taller, slimmer, fuller or softer, depending on what the current court preferred. Let's not forget the ultimate status signal, how little you had to move. If your garments were so tightly fitted, so delicately constructed, that walking too quickly might pop a seam or reveal a sweat stain, that was the goal. Movement meant labour, stillness meant power. So next time you slip into something structured or throw on a belt to create a waistline where none exists, know you're participating in a tradition older than most cathedrals. The medieval silhouette wasn't about celebrating natural beauty. It was about crafting beauty, layer by layer, stitch by stitch, an illusion by glorious illusion. So you've got the silhouette, the flush, the hair, the death trap shoes, and you're swanning around like some kind of medieval dream. But don't get too confident just yet. There's one more facial feature everyone's secretly judging you for, even if they don't say it out loud. Your nose. Yep, that oddly specific bit of cartilage in the centre of your face was quietly running the show, and in the Middle Ages, the right kind of nose could mean the difference between being immortalised in a courtly ballad or mistaken for someone who churns butter for a living. Now, before we dive in, let's be clear. There wasn't just one perfect nose. Standards varied by time, region, and level of obsession, as with ancient Roman statues. But in general, a straight, narrow nose with a slightly upturned or aquiline tip was considered ideal in most of Western Europe. It projected nobility, intelligence, and that mysterious, slightly aloof vibe that medieval poets absolutely could not shut up about. Writers were weirdly specific about it. One English romance from the 14th century describes a noblewoman's nose as slender as a reed, with the colour of ivory and the shape of a hunting hawk's beak. That's not just admiration, that's nose worship. The nose wasn't just a thing on your face, it was a symbol of bloodline. A noble profile meant a noble heart. Also, people like to pretend. Artists, of course, helped shape this ideal. In countless frescoes, tapestries and illuminated manuscript, the fashionable nose stands out. Fine bridge, soft slope, no bumps, and absolutely no flaring nostrils. Flared nostrils were considered coarse and animalistic, or, God forbid, suggestive of lust. A dainty, modest nose suggested a dainty, modest woman, because naturally all your virtue resided between your eyes. This standard wasn't just aesthetic, it had roots in physiognomy, the pseudo-scientific belief that facial features revealed personality traits. It was extremely popular during the Middle Ages. According to the experts of the day, a woman with a long straight nose was wise and chaste. A hooked nose meant ambition or cleverness, possibly dangerous in a woman. A snub nose, frivolous, upturned, flighty, flattened, lowborn, you get the idea. And this wasn't just speculation. People actually consulted physiognomy guides when choosing marriage partners. You'd find diagrams in medical books detailing noses of virtue versus noses of vice. It was like astrology for your face, except instead of blaming your poor decisions on Mercury retrograde, you could just say, well, look at my nose. Obviously I was meant to be difficult. But here's the awkward twist. Noses were hard to fix. Unlike skin tone, hair, or even body shape, you couldn't exactly pluck your way to a better profile, and makeup was limited to cheeks and lips. Foundation and contouring hadn't been invented yet, not unless you counted smearing crushed pearl on your face and hoping for the best. So what did people do if their nose didn't quite meet the high standard? They got strategic. One common trick was veiling. It wasn't just about modesty or religious observance, it was practical. Veils could obscure a profile, soften the shape of a face, and turn a not-so-noble nose into a blurry suggestion of one. Hoods and wimples also helped. You'd see women arranging the folds of fabric to frame their faces in just the right way, like proto-contouring with silk. Then there was posture. In portraiture and social life, people learned how to turn their heads slightly. Never full-on, never too much of a side view to show the most flattering angle. A lowered chin gave a better slope, tilted just so, and a larger or bumpier nose seemed softer, gentler. Because even if you couldn't change your face, you could definitely edit the vibe. Fringe fact, some court ladies allegedly applied tiny spots of red to the tip of the nose during feasts, not as decoration, but to warm the face and draw attention away from less than perfect lines. It was a weird balancing act. Enough colour to seem youthful, but not so much that people thought you were drunk or sick. Remember, redness on the nose was also associated with excessive drinking, especially in men. There were even satirical poems about knights whose noses blushed before their hearts did. The church, for its part, didn't get too involved in nose politics, blessedly, though they did have things to say when women started getting creative. One 13th century friar grumbled about women using foreign powders to disguise their natural features, including applying venoms of the East to bleach the skin and soothe the nose's proud slope. It's unclear exactly what he meant, but it sounds like some kind of early attempt at smoothing or highlighting the bridge of the nose, maybe with chalk or crushed shells, or maybe he was just bitter about being celibate. We also can't ignore the cultural diversity of nose ideals across medieval Europe. In Spain, with strong Moorish influence, broader, more prominent noses were often associated with wisdom and spiritual power. In parts of Eastern Europe, hooked noses were considered distinguished, especially among older men. And in Jewish communities, where facial features were often unfairly stereotyped by outsiders, the nose became a loaded symbol, a target for prejudice, yes, but also a site of pride and identity. It's a reminder that beauty standards were never neutral. They were tied to politics, religion, and deep social tensions. And yet, even with all that pressure, noses were rarely surgically altered. There's no evidence of routine cosmetic procedures in the Middle Ages. If someone broke their nose or suffered disfigurement from illness or battle, they might consult a physician for reconstruction, usually with terrifying tools and no anesthesia, but elective cosmetic surgery, that was more of a Renaissance and post-Renaissance development. Instead, people embraced the tools they did have: light, fabric, poetry, posture, and strategic candle placement. And let's not forget the power of the ideal itself. Even if you didn't have the right nose, you could still participate in the fantasy. You could style yourself in a way that hinted at nobility, painted a picture of refinement, suggested a gentler bone structure than what reality had given you. And there's something weirdly comforting about that. Because when you step back and look at the big picture, medieval beauty wasn't always about being the ideal. It was about suggesting it. You didn't have to have the best nose, you just had to know how to show it, frame it, and let people believe. So tonight, as you look in the mirror and maybe side-eye your own reflection from just the right angle, take comfort in the fact that medieval nobles were doing the exact same thing, angling their heads, softening the light, adjusting their veils, trying to turn cartilage into glass. So far, you're a medieval vision, high forehead, invisible brows, delicately flushed cheeks, hair so long and golden it practically sings hymns, and shoes that defy physics and reason. But now we're heading into the territory no one ever wants to talk about. Your mouth, more specifically your teeth, your breath, and that little-known quest for what we'll politely call medieval mintiness. Let's start with the obvious. Dental hygiene in the Middle Ages was not exactly glamorous. Toothpaste didn't exist in the modern sense. Toothbrushes were primitive at best, and dentistry as a profession was somewhere between folk art and medieval horror movie. And yet people still cared about how their mouths looked and smelled. In fact, having clean, white, even our teeth was considered a sign of youth, good health, and social refinement. Of course, the average medieval diet wasn't doing anyone any favours. Even nobles, who weren't exactly gnawing on tree bark, were consuming a lot of bread, often coarse and full of grit, dried meats, wine, and stewed fruits. Sugars was rare and expensive until later in the period, so the classic modern sugar-induced tooth rot wasn't widespread until the Renaissance. But still, wear and tear happened. Especially when your flour was ground with stone and the occasional pebble ended up in your dinner roll. So what did people actually do to maintain their dental aesthetics? You might be surprised. Medieval tooth care wasn't just a desperate flailing in the dark. It was, in many cases, surprisingly thoughtful. People used toothpicks made of silver, wood, or goose quills. They'd swish herbal rinses made from mint, sage, or anise in warm water. And yes, they even had early versions of toothbrushes, usually small cloths or chewed twigs rubbed against the teeth, sometimes dipped in a powder made from salt, charcoal, crushed eggshells, or even burned rosemary. That smell in your mouth after a good swish of scorched herb ash, that was prestige. There's also written evidence that noble women were especially concerned with fresh breath. Because remember, medieval courtship was up close and personal. You didn't have the luxury of ghosting someone via text. If you wanted to flirt, you had to whisper, and that meant your breath had to be acceptable, if not downright inviting. Enter breath fresheners. People chewed on cloves, cardamom, fennel seeds, parsley, and little clumps of myrrh or frankincense. Chewing gum didn't exist, but people improvised with tree resin or beeswax infused with herbs. Wealthy folks had tiny ornate boxes called sweet coffers, where they kept their favourite breath-enhancing ingredients. Think of them as medieval Altoid tins, but made of silver and engraved with flowers. Fringe fact for you, some nobles would press crusts of lightly toasted bread against their gums and teeth to absorb decay. They believed the charcoal from the bread helped neutralise bad breath, and while that sounds ridiculous, modern charcoal toothpaste might owe them an awkward, smoky thank you. The bread crusts, by the way, were often reused several times, which is less charming. Let's just say dental hygiene had ambition, even if it didn't always have follow-through. But let's talk about what people feared. Tooth loss. A missing front tooth wasn't just a cosmetic issue, it was social doom. A big toothy smile was associated with youth and beauty, but once your teeth started falling out, you were practically tossed into the hag category, no matter your age. And unlike today, where veneers and implants are a phone call away, your options were medieval. There were dental prosthetics, sort of. In some wealthy cases, missing teeth were replaced with carved ivory pegs, bits of bone, or even teeth from other people. There's some evidence of early dentures, usually uncomfortable wooden contraptions tied in place with threads or wire. They weren't common, and they certainly weren't invisible, but the concept was there. Function first, fashion second, and while whiteness was prized, too white teeth were suspicious. In some cases, unnaturally pale teeth were associated with illness or demonic possession, because of course medieval people always found a way to make beauty terrifying. The goal was to have a pearl-like smile, softly white but not blinding. Not everyone could achieve this, obviously, but the ideal floated around court like a dental ghost haunting your mead-soaked breath. Oh, and just in case you're wondering if lipstick was a thing, yes, it kind of was. Certain balms and tints were applied to the lips to make them redder, softer looking, and less cracked. Dry lips were associated with poor health or grief, but again this was done very delicately. Too much red, and you looked like you were either in mourning or up to no good. It was a tightrope. You wanted your lips to look healthy, but not seductive. Charming, but not worldly. The lips were for prayer, after all, and maybe a chaste peck on the hand. Which brings us to kissing. A well-maintained mouth was crucial in courtly love. When knights swore fealty to a lady, it often ended with a kiss. Not necessarily romantic, but certainly symbolic. And if that kiss involved breath that smelled like week old onions, well, your chivalry just took a nosedive. Poets even wrote about it. One 14th century French lyric praises a woman whose breath was sweet as orchard wind, while another curses a lady whose kiss was like milk gone sour. Brutal. There's also a scholarly debate about whether dental hygiene rituals were truly common or limited to the nobility. Some argue that peasant communities used herbal rinses and toothpicks too, especially since many of the materials, mint, sage, birch, were freely available. Others believe the obsession with breath and teeth was largely elite, exaggerated by literature and court records. The truth is probably somewhere in between. Access may have varied, but desire for a pleasant mouth? Universal. And even the church got involved, sort of. There were a few grumpy sermons about women who chew exotic herbs to trick men into desire, equating mint breath with witchcraft light seduction. Because of course they did. But others actually promoted clean mouths as a sign of respect for God, even comparing a well-kept mouth to a clean chapel. A strange but oddly poetic analogy. Still, despite all this, most people would have had some degree of dental decay, especially later in life. You didn't need perfect teeth to be considered beautiful. You just needed the suggestion of health. A closed-mouthed smile, a faint scent of cloves, lips that didn't crack under the pressure of winter frost. That was enough to get by. So, if you're ever having a self-conscious moment about your breath or panicking because you forgot to floss, just know that someone in 13th century Burgundy was doing the exact same thing. Probably while chewing on fennel seeds and praying their front tooth didn't fall out during the royal feast. And if you're tempted to skip your nighttime brushing, don't, because at least you're not out here rubbing burnt rosemary on your gums and saving toasted bread crusts for dental touch-ups. Count your blessings, and maybe your teeth while you're at it. So your mouth smells like a spicy herb garden, your cheeks have that just-prayed flush, and your shoes are slowly suffocating your toes. You're practically ready for a medieval gala. Except, hang on, you missed a spot, or rather several. It's time to address the not-so-silent obsession lurking beneath all that lace and velvet. Body hair. Let's not be coy. The medieval approach to body hair was complicated, practical, superstitious, and frankly, pretty inconsistent. Some things they wanted completely gone, others they didn't talk about much. And in some cases, the hair itself wasn't even the issue. It was what it supposedly meant about you. Let's start with the most obvious. Facial hair on women. The ideal medieval woman, especially among the nobility, was smooth, soft and hairless, except for that elaborately styled head of hair, which, ironically, she wasn't supposed to show in public anyway. Everything else, unwelcome fuzz, downy upper lips, stray chin hairs, or even dark peach fuzz were considered unladylike and, if visible, scandalous. The solution? Enter early hair removal methods, most of which were aggressive enough to make modern waxing seem like a spa treatment. Tweezing was common, yes, but for larger areas, women turned to depilatory creams made from a terrifying mix of ingredients: quicklime, vinegar, arsenic, walnut oil, and even cat feces. You'd apply the paste to the offending area, wait until it started to burn a little, just enough to get nervous, and then scrape it off with a blunt knife or cloth. Did it work? Sometimes. Did it also leave your skin red and raw? Absolutely. Fringe fact, in one particularly grim beauty manual from the 14th century, women are instructed to pluck the brow and the jaw, then rub with goat's bile to close the pores and prevent further growth. You can almost hear the poor maid whispering, "Are you sure about this, m'lady?" But it wasn't just about facial hair, body hair, arms, legs, and yes, even the pubic region was also subject to scrutiny, particularly in noble and courtly circles. While not as openly discussed as facial grooming, there are enough surviving texts and illustrations to suggest that hairlessness, or at least the appearance of it, was considered a mark of refinement. And again, it wasn't just aesthetics. Medieval people genuinely believed that hairiness in women, especially excessive or coarse hair, was a sign of poor character. According to some medieval physicians, body hair indicated an imbalance in the humours, specifically too much heat and dryness, traits associated with men. A woman with visible body hair might be considered too masculine, too passionate, or worse, potentially unfaithful, That's right. Medieval pseudoscience was out here accusing women of infidelity based on ankle fuzz. The removal methods didn't stop with creams and tweezers. Threading, known in some parts of the Middle East and North Africa, made its way into Europe by way of trade routes, particularly in Spain and Sicily. It wasn't widespread, but in some cosmopolitan courts, you'd find women using tightly wound thread to yank out unwanted hairs with surgical precision. Sound familiar? Yes, threading has been around for a long time, and yes, it still hurts. Men, on the other hand, had a different relationship with body hair. A nobleman's beard was a statement, and what kind of statement depended heavily on the era and the region. In the early Middle Ages, full beards were often linked to wisdom, strength, and virility. Think Viking energy. But as we move into the later medieval period, especially in Western Europe, the trend shifts. The fashionable man was clean-shaven or sported a neatly trimmed, very curated beard, usually short and pointed, sometimes styled into ridiculous shapes that wouldn't look out of place in a Renaissance fair cosplay booth. For men, shaving wasn't just grooming, it was status. Having the tools and time to maintain a neat appearance signalled wealth and sophistication. Barbers, who also acted as surgeons, yes, really, handled the task, often with razors that looked more like torture devices. Still, men who could afford it went in for regular shaves and trims, sometimes scented with bay leaf or lavender water. But body hair? For men, less commentary. It wasn't seen as sexy or unsexy, it just was. If anything, a man without body hair might have raised eyebrows. Masculinity was tied to hair, strength, and control. And while knights were perfectly fine spending hours polishing their armour and arranging their capes just so, no one expected them to wax their chests. At least not yet. Still, there were exceptions. In courtly love literature, the idealised male often had smooth skin, at least on the face, neck, and hands. The goal was to look clean, youthful, and polished. So while no one was manscaping for the jousting tournament, a little hair management wasn't unheard of in elite circles. And again, context was everything. Let's not skip over the symbolic use of hair either. For both men and women, hair was often treated as a spiritual and emotional signifier. Think of the nun who cuts her hair as a symbol of giving herself to God, or the widow who shaves her head in mourning. Hair removed, or not, could tell a story. In certain religious orders, women were required to maintain shorn or veiled heads at all times, and some religious communities even encouraged depilation of the entire body as a sign of rejection of worldly desires. If that sounds extreme, well, so were their beauty goals, except instead of seducing, they were unseducing themselves. Aesthetic fasting, if you will. Scholars still debate how widespread these grooming practices really were. Were all noble women really slathering themselves in lime paste every week? Probably not, but among the elite, it was likely common enough to be considered normal, especially before major feasts, religious ceremonies, or social appearances. Grooming was about more than vanity. It was a form of discipline, a quiet signal of your rank, your self-control, and your commitment to the ideal of the well-ordered body. And as always, there was pushback. Satirical poems often mocked high-born women for their grooming rituals, comparing them to birds picking their own feathers or animals preening obsessively. One poem describes a noblewoman who plucked herself till she was smooth as wax, but with a heart like thorns. Translation: too much beauty work is a moral danger, which, let's be honest, is a message women have been receiving in one form or another for about 1,000 years. But still they plucked, and burned, and scraped, all in pursuit of an ideal that was as elusive as it was painful. So the next time you debate whether to shave your legs or cancel that waxing appointment, take a moment to thank your lucky stars you're not reaching for a bowl of arsenic-laced quicklime. And remember, in the grand medieval beauty game, smooth skin wasn't just a preference, it was practically a virtue. At this point you're practically glowing, forehead plucked, hair spun into gold, skin smooth and slightly on fire from whatever goat bile you smeared on it earlier. You've shaped your silhouette like an architectural masterpiece. Your teeth are mostly intact, and your breath smells faintly of fennel and despair. But there's one last detail that people in medieval Europe were constantly obsessing over, sometimes even more than the nose or the cheeks, your eyes. Yes, the so-called windows to the soul were under intense scrutiny in the Middle Ages, not just for how they looked, but for what they were thought to reveal. This was a society that genuinely believed your eyes could tell the truth even when your mouth lied. You couldn't hide your soul from someone who knew how to read your gaze, so naturally, people started trying to cheat the system. Let's start with what made an eye beautiful. According to medieval texts, medical, poetic and religious alike, the ideal eye was large, almond-shaped and clear. The colour, that varied. In some regions, light blue or grey eyes were considered divine, especially in northern Europe where those colours were rare and carried angelic connotations. Think pale, glowing irises like moonlight reflecting off ice. A woman with silvery blue eyes could be compared to saints or even celestial bodies. Sounds flattering until you realise most of those saints were also expected to be chaste, silent and conveniently tragic. In southern regions, however, dark eyes were celebrated, especially in poetry. Brown or black eyes were described as deep wells, pools of mystery or night eyes in love lyrics and songs. They were said to be more intense, more passionate. So while northern Europe was painting their muses with frost-coloured glances, southern poets were out here drowning in smoky eye contact. And the whites of the eyes, extremely important. The medieval beauty ideal demanded that the sclera, the white part of the eye, be just that. White, not yellowed or bloodshot, which were considered signs of illness, impurity or excessive emotion. Some women would use rosewater or fennel infusions to rinse their eyes, hoping to clear any redness or dullness. Others turned to far riskier options, tiny amounts of lead-based powders or eye whiteners that did make the whites brighter, right before they burned your corneas. But hey, anything for that saintly sparkle, right? And let's talk about the pupils. This is where things take a turn toward the deeply unhinged. There was a fad, especially in the 14th and 15th centuries, where women deliberately dilated their pupils to appear more alluring. They used an extract from the belladonna plant, also known as deadly nightshade. You'd put a drop or two in each eye, and boom, your pupils expanded, your gaze softened, and your admirers swooned. The effect? Dreamy. The risk? Also dreamy, because you might pass out. Belladonna is highly toxic. Too much and you would experience blurred vision, hallucinations, and occasionally death. But fashion waits for no one. If a few poison drops could make your eyes look more mysterious and in love, then it was worth the gamble. According to some court rumours, a few women even kept tiny vials of the stuff hidden in their sleeves, like romantic assassins, ready to blind themselves at a moment's notice. And if you think the obsession with the eyes stopped there, think again. Eyelashes were a whole other battlefield. Long lashes were considered beautiful, but not too long, just enough to make the eyes look soft and feminine. Women sometimes darkened their lashes with soot mixed into a waxy base, applied with a small stick or even a fingertip. Think of it as proto-mascara, but with the very real chance of setting your lashes on fire if the candle got too close. Eyebrows, we already know, were optional at best, but framing the eyes just enough to draw attention to them, that was the goal. Some beauty manuals advised lightly smudging dark herbs just above the lid to enhance the contrast with the whites of the eyes like early smoky eyeliner, but again, moderation was key. Too much drama and you were seen as vain or worse, a seductress. The church did not approve of anyone looking intentionally enchanting. It was supposed to happen by accident, while you were on your way to confession or feeding the poor. Of course, not everyone had perfect eye shapes or colours. And here's where medieval ingenuity kicked in. There were whispered recipes for eye drops made from poppy juice, milk and powdered pearls, yes, actual pearls, meant to brighten and enlighten the gaze. Some physicians warned against these concoctions, but others swore by them. As with all things medieval, the line between medicine and magic was extremely blurry and sometimes literally burned your retinas. Let's not forget the symbolic role of the eyes. Beyond their physical appearance, eyes were loaded with meaning. They were seen as both receivers and transmitters, capable of absorbing sin and radiating virtue. A woman's chaste gaze could protect her from evil, while an unchaste gaze could seduce a man to ruin. Entire sermons were built around warning young ladies to lower their eyes in public, avoid prolonged eye contact, and never ever stare directly at a priest. That would be basically spiritual flirting. But then, on the flip side, you have the literature of courtly love. Poems, songs, and stories where the lover falls madly, hopelessly in some door with a woman's eyes. Not her words, not her smile, just a look. One glance across a crowded hall and boom, he's writing sonnets under moonlight and challenging other men to duels for her honour. So while the church was busy scolding women for making eye contact, the poets were out here weaponizing it. This contradiction between the sacred and the seductive ran through all of medieval beauty culture, but it was especially sharp when it came to the eyes. They were supposed to be innocent, pure, and reflective of the soul. But at the same time, they were dangerously expressive, emotionally revealing, and in the wrong lighting, outright flirtatious. No wonder people were obsessed. Even scholars today argue over whether these eye-related beauty practices were widespread or exaggerated in art and literature. Some say they were niche trends limited to the highest ranks of nobility, while others believe that, thanks to the slow trickle-down effect of beauty ideals, even merchant-class women were experimenting with eye-washing and belladonna drops when they could afford it. And while the archaeological record won't give us bottles of medieval mascara, it does give us the texts, letters and portraits that show how central the gaze really was. So next time you're blinking into your bathroom mirror, dabbing on eye cream, or deciding whether your eyeliner wing is too dramatic for brunch, just know you're participating in an ancient, slightly dangerous, highly poetic tradition. And maybe if you lean into the candlelight just right, your pupils will catch that perfect glimmer, the kind that once made a knight swear loyalty or a friar write a 3-page sermon warning everyone else about you. Alright, so your eyes are smouldering just enough to either inspire a love poem or get you excommunicated. Your breath smells like a bouquet of crushed mint and regret, and your cheeks have that suspiciously divine flush. Now, take a deep breath, because we're about to enter one of the most underappreciated arenas of medieval beauty. Scent. Yes, selmui, that invisible, potent little detail that could determine whether someone thought you were angelic or just decomposing. And let's be honest, hygiene in the Middle Ages wasn't exactly winning any modern awards. Daily bathing was rare, water was questionable, and deodorant was, at best, a theory. So how did medieval people, especially those in courtly, high-stakes social circles, manage to smell good enough to be considered beautiful? The answer? Perfume, herbs, spices, flowers, smoke, bread crusts. Yes, you heard that last one right. We'll get there. First, let's start with what they did not have. No aerosol sprays, no roll-ons, no spritz and go. Everything smelled stronger, denser, and far more natural, which, to be fair, sometimes meant a little like sheep. Scent was about masking, yes, but also about status. A noblewoman who smelled like rosewater and cloves told the world, without saying a word, that she had the time, money, and staff to avoid smelling like everyone else. Let's talk about the actual perfumes. Many were oil-based, created by steeping dried petals, herbs or spices in oil or animal fat, then straining the result into tiny ornate glass or ceramic vessels. The most popular scent bases: rose, lavender, jasmine, sandalwood, myrrh, frankincense and musk. These weren't just for show, they had symbolic meanings too. Rose was purity and love. Lavender was protection and cleanliness. Musk was sensual and, depending on who you asked, slightly dangerous. And yes, real musk came from glands near the tail end of a male deer. Exotic? Yes. Horrifying? Also yes. Highly prized? Absolutely. Wealthy women dabbed a little behind the ears, on the wrists, or onto the hem of their gowns, so the scent would rise subtly as they walked. You didn't want to smell like you were trying to smell good. You just wanted to smell inexplicably expensive. For people who couldn't afford perfume, there were other options. Herbal sachets were popular. Small, cloth pouches filled with dried rosemary, sage, thyme, or marjoram tucked into bodices or pinned under sleeves. The warmth of the body would activate the scent throughout the day. Some even stitched sachets directly into their clothing, like a medieval version of those laundry scent beads, except, sewn into your dress and possibly containing powdered cinnamon bark. Fringe fact? Some noblewomen rubbed fresh herbs directly onto their skin before important events, like weddings or feast days. Sage, mint and lemon balm were all fair game. A lady might even press petals into her neckline for an extra aromatic boost, especially if she expected close encounters or long hours trapped in poorly ventilated stone halls. And then there was fumigation. Sounds dramatic, but it was really just smoke-based scenting. People, especially nobles, burned incense or herbs in their rooms, letting the smoke perfume their hair and clothes. Sometimes they would stand in the smoke of a burning herb bundle as part of their morning routine. Rosemary smoke was popular for women. Bay leaves and cloves were common for men. If you caught a whiff of someone's cloak and it reminded you of burning sage, you weren't wrong. That was literally their version of signature scent. Now let's talk about the weirdest trick in the medieval beauty playbook: toasted bread crusts. Some sources describe people carrying a slice of lightly burnt bread in their underclothes or inside their sleeves. The char was thought to absorb body odour and even purify the surrounding air. Is it effective? Modern science says not really, but in a time before deodorant it beat nothing. Plus it gave people an excuse to say, I'm not sweating, I'm purifying myself with artisanal crust. As for actual bathing, that was complicated. While early medieval folks, especially in Islamic and Byzantine regions, bathed regularly by the high to late Middle Ages in much of Western Europe, public bathhouses were often associated with disease, sin or prostitution. That didn't stop people from washing altogether, they just got creative. Basin baths, foot baths and sponge baths were more common among the upper classes. They'd focus on hot zones, armpits, feet, face, often using scented waters or oils. Again, rosewater was king. A noble woman might spend more time applying scented oils than actually washing. Hair too was part of the scent equation. Some women perfumed their hair directly, especially if it was unwashed for days or weeks. A comb dipped in scented oil might be used each morning to distribute fragrance through the strands. For brunettes, rosemary or clove oil was preferred. For blondes, chamomile or lily. There was even a belief that certain scents enhanced hair colour. Chamomile supposedly brightened golden locks, while sage deepened dark ones. No modern shampoo, but hey, they were still chasing those undertones. Men, of course, had their own scent standards. A clean-shaven knight might rub his beard line with bay oil or cedarwood. Scented gloves, yes, gloves, were a major status symbol. Infused with ambergris or civet, another animal-derived fragrance, they were basically the medieval equivalent of expensive cologne. A lady might lean in to kiss a man's hand and catch a whiff of something exotic and spicy, instantly pegging him as high status, or at least high maintenance. Now, scholars still debate just how much the average medieval person cared about smell. Was this level of scent obsession common, or was it limited to the nobility? Evidence suggests that while peasants didn't dab on ambergris before heading to the market, they did use herbs in clever ways, hanging them in their homes, using them in footbaths, even rubbing mint on their clothing before church. So maybe the class divide was more about access than desire. Everyone wanted to smell nice, some just had more cash to burn while doing it. Religion also got its nose involved. A certain scents, like frankincense and myrrh, were used in churches and associated with purity, holiness, and divine presence. Smelling like these substances could elevate a person spiritually, or at least make them smell like they'd just stepped out of Mass. And yes, some clergymen raised eyebrows at the growing obsession with fragrant vanities, calling perfume a distraction from inner virtue. But others embraced it, especially in monastic settings, where herb gardens were cultivated not just for food and medicine, but for aromatic use. So tonight, as you roll on that deodorant or spritz your favourite perfume, know this, you're carrying on a long tradition of trying to smell like you're ethereal and unreachable while living in a world that, well, definitely did not smell like fresh linen. And maybe, somewhere deep in your closet, there's an old crust of bread just waiting to make its medieval comeback. So you're radiating scent like a lavender bush on fire. Your skin is scorched to perfection. Your body has been laced, padded, and perfumed into the ideal silhouette. And at this point you're ready to mingle at court, right? Well, not so fast. Before you step into that hall and make eye contact with the wrong troubadour, let's address something that could unravel your entire beauty routine with a single whispered accusation. Cosmetics or witchcraft? Yeah. Welcome to the razor-thin line between looking divine and being accused of consorting with the devil. Because in medieval Europe, the pressure to look beautiful existed side by side with intense religious anxiety about how you got that way. And if you were caught leaning too hard into powders, potions, or anything that smelled even slightly exotic, you might find yourself being admired one moment and exercised the next. Let's be clear, the church didn't outright ban cosmetics, not officially. But it didn't love them either. Sermons were littered with warnings about vanity, deception, and the dangers of altering one's God-given appearance. The idea was that changing your face was an insult to your creator, basically medieval blasphemy via rouge. It didn't help that makeup often carried whiffs of foreign ingredients, trade routes, and strange knowledge. You want to really ruffle feathers in the 13th century? Wear imported eyeliner and call it a gift from the East. It was all about intent. If you were beautifying yourself for your husband, acceptable. If you were doing it to attract suitors, climb the social ladder, or heaven forbid, feel good about yourself? Scandalous. One particularly salty monk wrote, "She who paints her face paints her soul in ash." Not exactly Maybelline's best slogan. And don't even think about applying your makeup too well. If people could tell you were wearing the cosmetics, you were vain. If they couldn't tell and you looked mysteriously perfect, you were manipulative and potentially magical. That's right. Beautiful women were frequently accused of sorcery, especially if they used secret arts or rare ingredients. Did you achieve glowing skin because of crushed lily petals? Or because of an incantation whispered under the full moon? Hard to say. Fringe fact, some beauty recipes actually were written like spells. Medieval beauty manuals, yes, those existed, often blurred the line between skincare and sorcery. A woman might combine rose water with powdered silver and chant a rhyme, while stirring it clockwise 3 times. Whether it was science, superstition, or skincare ritual is anyone's guess, but it definitely raised some ecclesiastical eyebrows. The most suspicious beauty ingredients? Start with coal, used as eyeliner or to darken the lashes. It came from North Africa and the Middle East, which already gave it an exotic other status. Add to that the fact that it was often applied with a stick or sharp tool near the eyes, and you've got a recipe for suspicion. What else might she be drawing with that coal pencil? A sigil? A demonic rune? The average village priest wasn't thrilled to find out. Another favourite target was alum, used in whitening pastes and deodorants. Its sour smell and crystal form made people nervous, especially when it was stored in little vials or wrapped in cloth charms. People asked questions like, is she using it to smooth her skin, or summon spirits? It didn't help that a lot of beauty knowledge was passed down through midwives and older women, people already linked in the public imagination to folk magic. Let's talk about mirrors. You'd think that just checking your face would be harmless, but even that carried social weight. Obsessively looking into a mirror was seen as a mark of vanity at best, demonic influence at worst. The devil looks over her shoulder, one preacher warned, referring to a woman adjusting her head covering while peering into a polished glass, because naturally, Lucifer had nothing better to do than lurk in dressing rooms like the world's creepiest beauty consultant. Even worse was using a compact mirror in public or openly reapplying cosmetics. That wasn't just vanity, it was seen as a form of manipulation. You were crafting an illusion, constructing a false identity, lying with your face, and lying in medieval morality was a direct road to damnation. And let's not pretend these accusations were limited to whisper campaigns. There are documented cases of women, especially widows or unmarried women with a little too much free time and a little too much glow, being accused of witchcraft simply because they looked too good. If your skin was too smooth, your eyes too bright, and your hair too golden, people got suspicious. You couldn't win. Men were generally exempt from this kind of scrutiny. A nobleman using rose-scented oil or getting a shave from his personal barber was just refined. A woman with an unusually fresh complexion and well-plucked brows? That was unnatural. Sure, a few men got roasted in literature for being overly fussy, wearing too much scent or dressing like peacocks, but they didn't get burned at the stake for it. Women, unfortunately, had a much smaller margin of error. Even female healers and herbalists, many of whom passed along beauty or recipes, walked a dangerous line. They were the ones who knew how to make salves for burns, pastes for blemishes, and oils to remove hair or smooth scars. But knowledge was power, and a woman with too much of it, that was a threat. Which is probably why some women pretended their beauty was accidental. Oh, this glow, it's just my natural piety. Sure, Brenda, still... The line between beautification and sorcery wasn't always drawn with fire and pitchforks. In more cosmopolitan courts, especially those in Italy and Spain, cosmetics were viewed more favourably. Trade routes brought in beauty ingredients from as far as India and Persia, and with them came a slightly more relaxed attitude toward face enhancement. In Venice, for example, pale powdered faces and kohl-lined eyes were standard among wealthy women, and no one was accusing them of conjuring demons, at least not openly. But the anxiety never really disappeared. The medieval mind was constantly looking for what was real and what was false, and beauty was one of the most unstable categories of all. A woman could embody virtue and temptation. She could look divine and dangerous, and the more artfully she crafted her appearance, the more people questioned her intentions. Did she just want to look pretty, or was she bewitching the entire court? So next time you swipe on concealer or highlight your cheekbones, just remember, A few centuries ago, that might have been all it took to land you in front of an inquisitor with a very strong opinion on lip tint. But also remember this: medieval women kept doing it anyway. Despite the risks, the whispers, the double standards, they still blended powders, steeped herbs, smuggled oils from distant lands, and stared into those risky little mirrors with a quiet kind of rebellion. Because sometimes, looking good wasn't just vanity, it was rare, dangerous, controversial, radiant power. So you're teetering gracefully on the brink of witchcraft, cheeks rouged just shy of damnation, your perfumed gloves radiating clove-scented class warfare, and your eyes dilated to the point of mild hallucination. Life is good, that is, until someone leans in a little too close, peers at your jawline and spots a wart, or a scar, or, heaven forbid, a freckle. Suddenly, you're not a noblewoman, you're a walking omen. Yes, tonight we're talking about blemishes, and in the Middle Ages, your skin wasn't just skin, it was a spiritual billboard, a place where fate, morality, and superstition all took up residence. Warts, scars, moles, rashes, birthmarks, every mark meant something. Sometimes you were just unlucky, other times you were an actual danger to the realm. Let's begin with warts, the most suspicious of skin flaws. Today a wart is a nuisance. Back then, it could be interpreted as proof that you were consorting with dark forces. This belief wasn't purely cosmetic, it was spiritual. Warts were often seen as the physical residue of inner corruption, and if that wart happened to be on a suspicious location, say the hand, the foot, or gulp the back, you might be accused of bearing the witch's mark. The witch's mark was said to be a small imperfection given by the devil himself, used as a magical nipple to feed demonic spirits. Sounds ridiculous, but it was deadly serious. If a woman had a mole or scar in the wrong place, it could be interpreted as proof of witchcraft. And, no pressure, it could get her arrested, tortured, or worse. And since everyone has a mole or scar somewhere, you can imagine the general paranoia that caused. Scars too had their own brand of symbolism. On men, they could be badges of honour, a sign of battle, loyalty, or bravery. A knight with a sword scar across his jaw probably gets extra bread at dinner. But for women, it was a different story. A visible scar might suggest a shameful past, a fall from grace, or a punishment, or evidence of moral weakness. If it was on the face or hands, those high visibility areas, good luck getting a marriage proposal without a very generous dowry. And here's the catch. A woman might acquire a scar from childbirth, illness, or just bad luck, and still be judged for it. Healing was slow, medical knowledge was spotty at best. And if you healed wrong, with raised skin, discoloration, or lingering sores, it was seen as a reflection of spiritual decay. Not your fault, of course, but when has that ever stopped anyone? Now, freckles. Innocent little sun kisses today, but in the medieval era. They were often associated with peasantry, sin, or even licentiousness. Why? Because freckles implied sun exposure, a visual sign that you'd been outside doing labour, or at the very least not hiding under a linen veil like a respectable noblewoman. And in a world where pale skin equaled purity, anything that hinted at a tan was immediately suspect. There were even texts linking freckles to sexual indulgence. One 15th century physician wrote that women with the sun's dust upon their cheeks were inclined to passions of the flesh. So basically, freckles were a red flag, sometimes literally. Even if you weren't promiscuous, people might assume you were simply based on the pigment in your skin, and it wasn't just women. Men with freckles were occasionally described as earthy, unruly, or even beastly, a walking pigment chart of moral judgment. Birthmarks too were mini Rorschach tests for the medieval mind. Some believed that large birthmarks were the result of sins committed in the womb, or from impressions taken during pregnancy. There's a bizarre belief that if a pregnant woman saw something strange or sinful, a fire, a fight, or even a foreigner, it could mark the baby. So a girl born with a strawberry birthmark might be seen as cursed, even before she learned to walk. Totally normal parenting vibes. And then there were rashes and pox scars, which carried their own social weight. Skin diseases were often blamed on poor moral hygiene, as much as poor physical hygiene. For example, acne wasn't just teenage hormones, which, to be fair, medieval people didn't understand. It was seen as the body's punishment for gluttony, lust, or even lying. A red, inflamed face was not just uncomfortable, it was an outward sign of inward filth. Smallpox scars were especially devastating. Survivors, particularly women, were sometimes socially downgraded if their faces were left pitted or marked. There are court accounts of noble women being quietly retired from public view after surviving the pox, as if their faces had become unsuitable for high society. Some tried to cover the damage with veils, or with thick white powders that often caused their own skin problems. You win some, you lose skin, and just when you think it couldn't get more judgmental, there's there. Beauty spots, what we now call moles or small dark marks, could be charming or dangerous depending on placement. On the cheek or near the mouth, potentially alluring. On the forehead or neck, mysterious but passable. On the lower body or near a hidden area, absolutely scandalous. That spot might not just be pigmentation, it might be sin manifesting on the skin. Some women tried to remove blemishes using the terrifying beauty products we've already discussed. Lime paste, vinegar washes, or even acidic fruit juices. Others tried to hide their marks with lead-based white paint, which worked well enough until it started poisoning their skin, and blood and internal organs. But covering blemishes came with its own risk. If people suspected you were hiding something, the social fallout could be worse than the flaw itself. Fringe fact, a few medieval women went the opposite direction and faked beauty spots. Using soot or powdered antimony, they'd dot a small speck near the mouth or chin. Inspired by portraits or literature, it was an early version of the beauty mark trend that would later sweep through the Baroque and Rococo eras. The problem? If your fake mole started to smudge, you'd go from flirtatious to deceitful real fast. So what's the takeaway here? In medieval Europe, your skin wasn't neutral, it was narrative. Every blemish, mark or freckle told a story, whether you wanted it to or not. And while some people wore their imperfections with pride, or at least resignation, others spent their lives trying to erase, cover, or reinterpret them. Modern skincare routines might feel excessive, but compared to smearing goat bile on your jaw to hide a freckle that might get you branded a witch, they're practically a luxury. At least no one's staring at your moles and wondering if you've made a pact with Satan. So tonight, when you pass a mirror and see that little scar or beauty mark staring back at you, maybe give it a wink. It's not a flaw, it's character. And in the Middle Ages, it might have been your entire personality. You've made it this far. Flawless, or at least convincingly flawless skin, veiled hair shimmering with imported oil, and eyes full of either divine light or diluted belladonna. But you're not out of the woods yet. Because there's one thing you can't disguise, cover with silk, or pluck into submission, and that's sun exposure. Tonight we're stepping into the complex world of tans, freckles, burns, and all things sun-related, which in the medieval world were more than skin deep. They were status indicators, class signifiers, and sometimes, brace yourself, moral judgments baked right into your epidermis. Let's start with the obvious. Being tan was not cute, not in the medieval courts at least. In today's world, a tan might suggest a vacation, a day at the beach, a healthy outdoor lifestyle. But in medieval Europe, a tan said just one thing: you worked outside in the dirt like a peasant. This association wasn't just a passing fashion trend, it were baked, pun intended, into the entire class system. Nobility and the upper classes were supposed to have pale, untouched skin, a kind of blank canvas of privilege. Your complexion told people how far you were from the fields, from the sun, from labour. If your cheeks were ruddy from prayer and rosewater, fine. If they were browned by actual sunlight, scandalous. You might as well have shown up in burlap. This is why medieval beauty routines often included not just makeup but sun protection. Noble women wore the long sleeves year-round, not just for modesty but to protect their skin. Gloves, veils, wide hats, and even fans that doubled as sun shields were part of the arsenal. Some fashion manuals advised women to avoid open windows or candlelight that might brown the skin. That's right, they were dodging candlelight. That's commitment, and we can't skip the veils. Head coverings weren't just about modesty or fashion. They were often made of semi-translucent fabric, carefully chosen to allow airflow while filtering sunlight. Women would layer these veils over their faces, sometimes doubling up, creating a soft halo effect that made their complexions appear paler even in daylight. It was both cosmetic and functional, medieval SPF, if you will. Now, let's talk freckles, those charming constellations of sun-kissed pigment, or as medieval people sometimes saw them, signs of poor blood, outdoor labour, or a fiery temperament. We covered some of this when talking about blemishes, but it bears repeating, freckles were bad PR. You could get away with a few summer spots if you were a child or particularly pale otherwise, but too many, That meant you'd been spending time outside, which was immediately suspect. And then there were sunburns, which were more than just painful, they were embarrassing. A sunburn on a noblewoman wasn't just unattractive, it was unthinkable. It meant you had failed to maintain your veil, your canopy, or your delicate constitution. It meant you had exposed yourself to the elements, and in a world obsessed with control and composure, nothing was worse than an accidental flush from actual heat. If your cheeks were red, they'd better be red from love, shame, or divine inspiration, not the sun. Fringe fact, some noble women would apply white lead paste to sunburns, not to soothe them, heaven forbid, but to cover them up. Never mind that the paste itself was toxic and likely made things worse. Looking pale was more important than staying healthy. There's a documented case from the Burgundian court of a duchess who layered so much white powder over her sun-reddened arms that it started flaking off during a feast. Her maid later confessed that the duchess had refused to wear her sun sleeves because they clashed with her new gown. Priorities. Meanwhile, in the peasant world, sun exposure was simply part of life. Farmers, shepherds, labourers, everyone working outside developed tans, calluses, and the kind of rugged resilience that only comes from spending 14 hours chasing goats through a thistle field. And while there's little evidence they thought of their tan as ugly, it certainly wasn't fashionable. If anything, it marked them as unmistakably not noble, no matter how clean their clothes were or how carefully they plucked their brows for the village fair. And don't forget, class mobility was visual. If a merchant's daughter came into some money and tried to marry up, her skin might betray her. Pale skin could open doors, a hint of sun could slam them shut again. That's how loaded this was. Skin tone wasn't just a detail, it was a social passport. But here's the twist. Despite the obsession with paleness, some medieval texts, especially in poetry, begin to praise golden skin, especially in regions with Moorish, Byzantine, or Mediterranean influence. In southern Italy, Spain, and parts of the Islamic world, descriptions of beauty included warm tones, bronze glows, and olive complexions. These weren't seen as peasant markers, but as exotic allure. In fact, some of the most romanticised women in courtly love poetry had skin described as sun-kissed, or honeyed. So what gives? Well, as usual, it comes down to context. A golden complexion was beautiful if it was natural, if it came from a noble lineage, and if it wasn't the result of hard labour. In other words, you could be born with golden skin and be considered divine. But if you earned your tan the hard way, people turned up their powdered noses, because of course they did. Even within Western Europe, some poets bucked the trend. The troubadours of southern France occasionally sang about women with darker skin, calling them wild roses or daughters of the sun. Whether these were idealizations of local women or fantasy figures inspired by distant lands, they pushed back, gently, against the porcelain obsession. But did that change fashion at court? Not really. The pale ideal stayed dominant. And don't forget the religious angle. Pale skin was often linked to spiritual purity. Think of the Virgin Mary in every painting you've ever seen. Pale, smooth, softly lit, glowing like a marble statue. Saints, angels, even Christ himself were rendered in pale, luminous hues. Artists weren't going for realism. They were painting virtue, and virtue was white. That association ran deep, influencing beauty standards for centuries. Today, we understand that skin tone is a mix of genetics, environment, and sun exposure. But in the Middle Ages, people read it like a moral code. Pale meant pure, tan meant peasant, and anything in between was carefully managed with powders, veils, and avoiding the sun like it was actively plotting your social downfall. So next time you catch a tan, whether from a beach day or just a long walk in the park, take a moment to appreciate your freedom. You're not going to get disinvited from a feast or whispered about by nuns because your arms look earthy. No one's inspecting your hands for signs of labour. You can even, gasp, enjoy the sun. And maybe, just maybe, thank the ghost of some medieval woman who sat sweating under 3 layers of linen just to avoid freckles, praying her veil didn't slip in the wind. Also, she could walk into a candlelit banquet and pretend her skin had never seen a single ray of light. You've cloaked yourself in veils to preserve your ghostly pallor, dabbed your skin with rose water, and artfully arranged every strand of your golden, or convincingly golden hair. But even with all that effort, you're still not in full control of your beauty narrative, because guess what? The church is. And tonight, we're diving into how the Virgin Mary became the ultimate beauty influencer of the medieval world, without ever posting a single portrait. It might sound strange now, but in the Middle Ages, Christian beauty standards were not just about aesthetics, they were moral templates. And the model everyone was told to aspire to? Mary, the Holy Mother, Queen of Heaven, and the OG of silent, glowing, unattainable perfection. Let's start with the image. The Virgin Mary was almost always depicted with the same core features. Pale skin, yes, absolutely. That was non-negotiable. Soft, rounded features, high forehead, downcast eyes. No trace of sensuality, but plenty of serene sadness. She wasn't supposed to look sexy. She was supposed to look otherworldly. Gentle, glowing, inaccessible, and unfathomably good. This wasn't just art direction, it was ideology. Medieval women were taught that beauty wasn't just a gift from God, it was a moral duty, especially when modelled on Mary. Her beauty wasn't meant to attract men, it was meant to reflect her divine nature, her purity, her surrender to God's will. If you looked beautiful the right way, it suggested you were pure of heart. Beautiful the wrong way, you were asking for trouble, and probably a sermon. So what exactly was the Mary look? Let's break it down. First, the face. Mary's face was nearly always oval-shaped, with soft contours and little to no sharp angles. There was no contouring, no arched brows, nothing dramatic. Her features were deliberately blurred in many paintings to remove the appearance of temptation or even individuality, because being too memorable, too vivid, was seen as a kind of ego. You weren't supposed to stand out. You were supposed to reflect God's light, not become a light of your own. Then there were the eyes, always lowered, always modest, never direct, never bold. A woman with a Mary gaze was seen as chaste and obedient. She wasn't trying to seduce anyone. She was internal, contemplative, focused on things that mere mortals couldn't understand. The term virginal gaze wasn't just poetic, it was a real thing people aspired to. Think of it as the medieval version of resting virtue face. And let's not forget the clothing. Blue and white were Mary's signature colours. Blue for heaven and purity, white for chastity. Women at court began emulating these colours in their own wardrobes, especially on religious feast days. A noblewoman dressed in white and blue, with her veil just so and her hands clasped in modesty, was basically signalling, I'm like Mary, you can trust me. I'm not here to stir up desire. I'm here to radiate humility. But, plot twist, not all Marian imagery was soft and passive. In certain depictions, especially in the later Middle Ages, Mary starts taking on more powerful poses. She's crowned, enthroned, surrounded by angels. Her beauty becomes more regal, more defined. Her expression isn't just modest, it's knowing. Artists start giving her sharper cheekbones, clearer eyes, even a hint of personality. Why? Because as theology evolved, so did the image of Mary. She wasn't just a vessel, she was the Queen of Heaven, the ultimate intercessor, and that came with a little sparkle. This evolution had a trickle-down effect on courtly beauty. Suddenly being a little too soft wasn't enough. You had to balance virtuous stillness with subtle authority. A powerful noblewoman might still dress like Mary, but now she was expected to rule a household, direct servants, manage estates. So while her look stayed heavenly, her demeanour got just a little more commanding. Of course, all of this came with a deep undercurrent of shame and control. If you didn't match the Marian model, if your beauty was too bold, your eyes too sharp, your smile too knowing, people noticed, and not in a good way. You were compared not to Mary, but to Eve, the original troublemaker. The first woman, the first to fall, the reason we can't have nice things. And Eve's beauty, that was the wrong kind. Tempting, worldly, unruly. This dichotomy, Mary versus Eve, became the foundation for every beauty judgment a woman faced. Were you beautiful like Mary, untouched and modest? Or beautiful like Eve, confident and dangerous? You can probably guess which one got more poems and which one got more warnings. Fringe fact. In some convents, young novices were taught to mirror Mary's appearance as part of their spiritual training. They were encouraged to look into mirrors not to admire themselves, but to practice humility, checking their appearance to make sure it reflected cleanliness of the soul. There's even a recorded case of a nun who fasted for weeks after being complimented on her complexion. She feared her beauty was a test sent by Satan. That's the level of pressure we're dealing with. And it wasn't just women judging themselves. Men were complicit, of course, often the ones writing these ideals into poetry, painting them into altarpieces, or slipping them into sermons. A man might describe his lover as Mary-like in one breath, and accuse another woman of being Eve-born in the next. And women internalised it, competing to look both irresistible and irreproachable, like divine creatures who just happened to be born the noble. Now, scholars today still debate how much influence the Virgin Mary truly had on secular beauty ideals. Some argue that her image was mostly spiritual, and didn't affect courtly fashion as much as we think. Others say she absolutely shaped everything from hairstyles to hemlines, because religion permeated every aspect of medieval life. The truth probably lies somewhere in between, but there's no denying that the Marian aesthetic was aspirational. Whether or not women could reach it, they were always measured against it. And let's be honest, it wasn't exactly attainable. The Virgin Mary never had to deal with sun damage, eyebrow regrowth, or a court full of jealous rivals whispering about her suspiciously smooth skin. She never had to scrub goat fat from her hair after a perfume experiment gone wrong. Her image was eternal, serene, perfect. Meanwhile, actual medieval women were just trying to get through the day without being mistaken for a temptress, or worse, a sorceress, with a bit of blush and a properly draped veil. So next time someone tells you beauty is shallow or vain, remind them that for centuries beauty wasn't just surface, it was salvation. And medieval women, they were navigating that minefield with powdered faces, sacred colour palettes, and enough moral pressure to crush a cathedral, and still somehow they managed to look divine. By now you've mastered the Virgin Mary aesthetic. Your skin is radiant, with just a hint of piety. Your veils are fluttering in the breeze like you're constantly on the verge of being canonised. And your scent is one rosemary sprig away from a travelling monastery. You're practically perfect. Which is exactly when Sumptuary law come crashing in like a medieval fashion police squad, complete with parchment scrolls and really judgy eyes. Yes, it's time to talk about how beauty wasn't just shaped by trends or religious ideals, but actively policed by the state. Because in the Middle Ages, you couldn't just wear what you wanted. You couldn't just look like a noble if you weren't one. That would have been social anarchy. So they made it illegal. Let's break it down. Sumptuary laws were legal codes that regulated what people could wear, eat, and sometimes even how they could decorate their homes, based entirely on social rank. If you were a duke, you could wear velvet. If you were a merchant's wife, maybe some fine wool, a farmer's daughter. Don't even think about satin, sweetie. These laws existed all over Europe, from England to France to Italy, and they weren't just guidelines. They were enforced with fines, public shaming, or, in more extreme cases, jail time. Imagine getting arrested because your dress had too many pearls on it. Welcome to the Middle Ages, where beauty could be criminal. And clothing wasn't the only thing under regulation. Makeup, hairstyles, jewellery, even fabric colours were all carefully monitored. In England, for example, only royalty and the highest nobility could wear purple, since the dye was expensive and symbolic of imperial power. Meanwhile, in Florence, you needed permission to wear gold thread in your dress. And in France, a law once specified that only prostitutes could wear a certain type of low-cut gown. That made for some awkward dinner parties. Why all this fuss? Because in medieval society, appearance was supposed to mirror the social order. You were supposed to look like your station. If a commoner dressed like a lady, she was seen as dangerous, deceptive, even subversive. She could seduce the wrong man, enter the wrong spaces, or, God forbid, start believing she deserved better. That kind of visual rebellion could tear the fabric of feudal life. Literally. And don't think these rules didn't affect beauty standards. They were baked into them. A noblewoman didn't just wear rich fabrics because she liked the feel of brocade. She wore them because her clothes, jewels, and grooming habits were visible proof of her virtue and status. And by extension, her beauty wasn't just about her features, it was about how well she performed, her class. Let's talk about her hair. For example, long, well-groomed hair was a sign of virtue and refinement. But depending on where you lived, wearing it uncovered could mark you as a flirt or worse. In many places, only unmarried maidens could go bareheaded in public. Married women were expected to wear wimples, veils, or hoods, and those veils regulated. Some cities capped the length of veils women could wear based on social class. The richer you were, the longer your veil. If yours dragged behind you like a bridal train, congratulations. You were either noble or getting fined. Jewellery also, too, was a minefield. Laws often forbade lower-ranking people from wearing certain gemstones, or even fake versions of them. In Venice, a woman of the artisan class couldn't wear earrings made of gold even if she inherited them. In England, middle-class women were banned from wearing girdles studded with precious stones. In some regions, widows had to wear muted colours and give up jewellery altogether, unless they were of a high enough rank to mourn fashionably. And then there was the face paint panic. In some areas, sumptuary laws specifically restricted the use of cosmetics, not always because of moral concerns, but because beauty too was seen as a luxury good. If a butcher's wife showed up at the market with powdered cheeks and a pearl drop on her forehead, people might assume she was of noble blood. That kind of confusion wasn't just annoying to the elites, it was viewed as more a threat to the divine social hierarchy. Fringe fact. In 14th century Florence, city officials created a literal fashion patri to inspect women's garments and accessories in public. They would measure sleeve width, count decorative buttons, and make sure your gown didn't violate any dress codes. Imagine a man with a clipboard walking up to you, squinting at your hemline and muttering, sorry, those fur-lined cuffs scream tax evasion. But of course, people found ways around it. Fashion, even under surveillance, is slippery. Wealthy merchants' wives would commission gowns just barely within the legal limits, or wear certain fabrics inside out to avoid detection. Some women wore detachable sleeves they could remove if they saw an inspector coming. Others got sneaky with while layering, hiding forbidden fabrics under legally permissible ones, like some kind of sartorial nesting doll. Beauty became a game of codes and subtext, and just like today, where knockoff designer bags and subtle brand flexes exist, medieval people got creative. Lower-class women would use clever embroidery, ribbons, and pinned flowers to dress up their looks without technically breaking the rules. And makeup, many women claimed they were just using healing salves or applying a poultice when questioned. Oh no sir, this is medicinal lead paste, not beauty lead paste. Totally different sin. It's worth noting that not everyone loved these laws. Some progressive thinkers of the time, yes, they existed, argued that beauty should be accessible, that a merchant's daughter had just as much right to a fine dress or a good pair of shoes as a baron's wife, but those voices were usually drowned out by waves of panic about social mobility. If people could look noble, they might start acting noble. And what happens to feudalism then? Modern scholars still debate how strictly sumptuary laws were enforced. Were people actually getting fined for wearing too much velvet? Probably not as often as the laws suggest, but that's not really the point. The threat of enforcement was often enough. Just knowing the rules existed made people hyper-aware of their place and how far they could push it. So next time you pull on that statement coat or toss on a necklace just because it feels fancy, take a moment to savour the freedom. You're not going to get stopped by a fashion patrol. You're not going to be fined for wearing earrings that sparkle too much for your tax bracket. And you can wear purple, any shade, any day of the week, and not be mistaken for royalty. But do tip your hat, if it's within your rank of course, to those medieval fashion rebels who pushed the boundaries one pearl, one braid, one forbidden velvet hem at a time. Because in their world, beauty wasn't just about looking good, it was about knowing the rules and knowing exactly how to break them. You've dodged the sumptuary police, your veil is the legal maximum length allowed for your station, or maybe just a smidge longer, and your gown is dripping with pearls that may or may not be gifts from an aunt in Genoa. You've mastered the balancing act between flaunting your beauty and avoiding a fine, but even with all this elegance, you're missing one crucial piece of the medieval beauty puzzle: accessories. Tonight we're diving into the world of medieval adornment. Those little glittering details that did more than sparkle. They whispered things about your class, your values, your marital status, and even your fertility. All while catching the flickering light of 100 torches in a stone hall. This wasn't just accessorizing. This was what strategic ornamentation, and it could make or break your entire look. Let's start with the crown jewel of accessories. Jewellery. In the medieval mind, beauty was never just about the face, it was about presentation. And that meant necklaces, rings, brooches, belts, and hairpins, all carefully chosen, arranged, and deployed like tiny declarations of who you were, or who you were pretending to be. A woman's jewellery collection was a walking resume: a heavy gold necklace, wealth and high birth, a simple silver brooch, respectable modesty, a necklace strung with coral beads, fertility symbol, pearls, purity, emeralds, wisdom, rubies, passion, and sometimes a dangerous amount of it. These associations weren't just aesthetic, they were embedded in religious teachings, folk traditions, and courtly literature. If you wore a ruby to the wrong feast, someone might assume you were angling for a dramatic affair. Or worse, a poem. Rings were especially loaded with meaning. A ring on the right hand might signal engagement or a legal contract. On the left, it might suggest a personal vow. Signet rings engraved with family crests or initials were common among noblemen and powerful women, used for stamping wax seals. But even those could carry layered messages: a ring with an anchor, hope, a ring with a serpent, wisdom, or temptation, depending on who was looking. Fringe fact: in some courts, women wore poison rings. Little hinged rings with hidden compartments, sometimes for perfume, sometimes for emergency arsenic. Romantic, right? She looked like an angel, but her ring held death. Sounds like something right out of a troubadour's tragedy. Now let's talk about belts. A strangely powerful and often overlooked part of medieval beauty. Women's belts weren't just functional, they were status symbols, and sometimes flirtation devices. A jewelled girdle worn low on the hips could accentuate the waist and hint at fertility, a constant medieval theme, while a thin chain belt slung over a tightly fitted gown whispered wealth, grace, and possibly even virginity, depending on whether the belt was unbroken. Yes, some women had chastity belts, designed to symbolise purity, even if they weren't the actual locking kind. Think of it as the medieval promise ring, but for your midsection. Belts could also be soul love tokens. A knight might gift his lady a belt or girdle before heading off to war. If she wore it publicly, it showed loyalty. If she tucked it away or gave it to another man, well, that's the stuff of courtly scandal. There are even records of men challenging each other to duels over who had the right to a particular woman's belt. So yes, medieval fashion came with a body count. Moving northward, literally, we hit the battlefield of hair accessories, one of the most emotionally charged zones in the beauty arena. A well-adorned braid could do more for your reputation than any sermon. Hair was already considered one of a woman's most potent weapons. Remember, long, untouched, covered, sacred, seductive, etc. So anything that drew attention to it was practically laced with subtext. Boy. Hairpins weren't just for holding things in place, they were for flexing. Wealthy women might use pins made of ivory, silver, or even gold, sometimes tipped with pearls or tiny cameos. Decorative combs were also a thing, especially in France and Italy. These weren't for detangling, they were for displaying on your dressing table where visitors might accidentally see them and know you are that kind of woman. The kind with grooming tools imported from Flanders, veil clips, jewelled nets, fillies, and decorative bands called chaplets, were also used to secure head coverings or create architectural hairstyles. Some of these pieces doubled as prayer charms, engraved with tiny Latin inscriptions. Others were straight-up fashion statements. Imagine attending a banquet and spotting another lady across the hall wearing your chaplet design. Cue the subtle, pointed glances and an entire passive-aggressive subtext war-waged in head tilts. Earrings, surprisingly, were less common in Western Europe, especially among Christian women. Why? Because the church didn't love them. Piercing the body for beauty was sometimes considered their vanity, or even sinful mutilation. That said, some Jewish and Moorish communities embraced earrings as part of cultural identity, and in certain Mediterranean courts, small hoop or pendant earrings became quietly popular despite the papal side-eye. But if earrings weren't common, brooches more than made up for it. These were the medieval equivalent of a signature accessory. Brooches fastened veils, cloaks, or sleeves, but they also announced who you were. Lovers gave each other brooches engraved with romantic mottos. mothers passed down brooches inscribed with prayers. And in times of mourning, women might wear jet black brooches shaped like leaves or crosses. Brooches were wearable mood boards before Pinterest existed, and of course, material mattered. Gold, silver and gemstones were reserved for the elite, but that didn't stop people from faking it. Gilded copper, glass gems and even polished bone were used to imitate the real thing. The Sumptuary laws, naturally, tried to crack down on this, but fashion has always been one step ahead. A merchant's daughter might wear an imitation sapphire pendant that fooled half the court, until someone touched it and realised it weighed like a chicken bone. Men had their own set of beauty-adjacent adornments, especially those of high rank. A fashionable man might wear a signet ring, a decorative belt, a jewelled dagger, purely decorative of course, and a fur-trimmed hat with a feather. Think of it as noble peacocking. His accessories said, "I'm rich, I'm powerful, and if you challenge me at chess, I'll ruin you." But for women, accessories weren't just decoration, they were currency. A woman's dowry might include her jewellery box. Her value could be increased by her collection, and in some cases, her survival depended on what she wore. There are stories of noble women pawning their belts, rings and pins to escape political upheaval, fund pilgrimages, or bribe guards. Your hairpin might save your life, or at least buy you a decent meal in a border town tavern. So tonight, when you lay out your jewellery or fasten that belt that doesn't actually hold anything up, remember, medieval women did the same thing. Not because they were vain, but because they knew how to use beauty, real or crafted, to navigate a world stacked against them. Because sometimes a brooch isn't just a brooch, it's a message, a signal, a choice, and sometimes it's armour. By now, you're an absolute masterpiece of medieval beauty. Your skin's porcelain perfection borders on the suspicious. Your belt is slung at the precise angle between modest and fertility symbol, and your hair accessories could double as diplomatic leverage in a minor border dispute. But what about the part of you no one is supposed to see, yet everyone is very, very invested in? Tonight, we slip elegantly and without scandal into the world of medieval undergarments. Now, before you start picturing satin and lace, slow down. This is the 14th century, not a Victoria's Secret catalogue. Medieval lingerie was less about seduction and more about structure, layering and class distinction. But make no mistake, what you wore underneath still played a major role in the beauty game, even if it never saw the light of day. Let's begin with the basics. The chemise, also called a shift or smock. This was the foundation of every woman's outfit. Worn closest to the skin, it was typically made of linen, cool, breathable, and if you were rich, finely woven to a butter-soft finish. Chemises absorbed sweat and body oils, sparing your outer gowns from wear and from frequent washing, which was considered risky for expensive fabrics. It was your daily skin barrier, your nightgown, and your hygiene hack all in one. A well-kept chemise was the sign of cleanliness and class. You could tell a woman's status by how white, soft, and finely embroidered her chemise was. Decorative edges peeked from sleeves and necklines, and for wealthier women, these borders were sometimes stitched with tiny initials, floral motifs, or even Latin prayers, because what's sexier than underclothes that double as a moral compass? Over the chemise came a set of structured garments that walked the line between fashion, function, and moral geometry. The most famous of these? The kirtle, a fitted dress that shaped the torso and lifted the bust long before underwires existed. A kirtle could be laced at the front, back, or sides depending on your social rank and what decade we're in. And yes, some laces were intentionally hidden to imply that you didn't dress yourself. Having someone else lace your bodice was a flex. Look at me, I'm too noble to reach my own waist. This layering didn't just support the body, it also smoothed it. The chemise, kirtle, and outer gown together created the ideal silhouette. Long torso, rounded bust, narrow shoulders. Padding might be added here and there, particularly in the bust line. Though it was subtle, we're not talking corsets yet, that comes later in fashion history, but these layers still functioned like pre-corset corsetry. Your posture improved, your waist looked smaller, your noble glow came with built-in scaffolding. Fringe fact, some women added small pillows called bum rolls under their skirts to create a fuller lower half. Early foreshadowing of later Renaissance silhouettes. The effect? You looked like you had a healthier, more fertile shape. And if it also made sitting impossible and walking mildly humiliating, worth it. And speaking of fertility, we must address the lingering obsession with the womb. Everything a woman wore under her clothes, especially around the midsection, was linked, however subtly, to her view of reproductive symbolism. Belts, ties, stays and panels were designed not just to flatter the figure, but to signal health and potential motherhood. A narrow waist, yes, but not too narrow. A woman had to look like she could carry noble airs while still being ethereal and delicate. No pressure. Now, what about actual underwear? Brace yourself. In most of Western Europe, women didn't wear drawers, that is, pants or underpants of any kind, until much later. That's right. Under that gown, nothing. Just layers of linen and open air. Men, on the other hand, often wore brays, a kind of baggy linen short. But for women, especially noble ones, the prevailing logic was that pants were masculine. To wear them was to invite suspicion, ridicule, or worse, accusations of cross-dressing or subversion. But did some women secretly wear them? Almost certainly. There are references in medical texts to linen underbindings, and even modesty cloths tied between the legs. Some scholars argue that these were early versions of underwear, worn during menstruation, pregnancy, or illness. But they weren't common, and they certainly weren't part of the glamorized beauty routine. If you were a fashionable lady at court, the assumption was that you floated through life in a linen shift and grace alone. Let's not forget stockings, which were acceptable. These were typically made of wool or silk, and they extended up the leg, held in place by garters, ribbons or ties bound just above or below the knee. Stockings served both warmth and allure. A glimpse of a stockinged ankle, accidental, was considered shockingly intimate. If someone saw your garter, scandal, or proposal, in some cases, garters were exchanged as tokens of affection. A knight might wear his lady's garter into battle, or she might give it to him before a tournament as a sign of support. Naturally, these accessories became eroticized, and poets couldn't resist turning every bit of ribbon into metaphor. Her leg, like ivory wrapped in silk, did tremble neath the lacing. You get the idea. Of course, not all undergarments were purely utilitarian or symbolic. Some were straight up luxurious. Wealthy women might line their shifts with swan's down or order chemises embroidered with real gold thread. A particularly extra French countess was known to keep 10 chemises on rotation, all bleached in milk and hung to dry in a special perfumed room. Imagine reaching for your daily undergarment and being surrounded by linen that smells like roses and holy water. Iconic. And when it came to intimacy, undergarments played a theatrical role. Courtly love often featured scenes of a knight glimpsing his lady's inner layers, or stealing a piece of lingerie as a token. Women might gift their lovers a ribbon, a garter, or a piece of lace as a sign of favour. These objects were often scented, intentionally. A lover would carry it with him, tucked into armour or inside a pouch, inhaling the memory of someone he was never supposed to touch. Now, scholars today debate how consistent undergarment use really was. Did every woman wear a chemise every day? Probably not. Laundry was labour-intensive and access to fine linen varied. Did lower-class women pad their hips for better silhouette? Doubtful. But what's clear is that for the upper echelons of medieval society, what lay beneath was just as carefully curated as what showed on the outside. Because undergarments were about layered identity. You weren't just a beautiful woman, you were clean, modest, desirable, untouchable, and noble, all at once. You didn't just wear beauty, you built it from the inside out. So tonight, when you fold your pyjamas or fasten a bra strap, take a second to appreciate your soft cotton and elastic. No one's inspecting your garters or lacing your bodice in silence before mass. But if they were, you'd know exactly how to pose and how to wear virtue like a second skin. So far, it's been all about you, your chemise, your chastity-coated belt, your rosemary-scented layers of linen. You've conquered the ever-shifting terrain of beauty with grace, style, and probably a mild case of powdered lead poisoning. But here's a twist in our story. You weren't the only one under pressure to look the part. Oh no, tonight let's talk about men. Yes, medieval men had their own beauty standards, expectations that shaped how they dressed, groomed, postured, and perfumed themselves for love, war, and everything in between. If you thought the women had it rough, well, they definitely did. But the men weren't exactly rolling out of bed and calling it a day. The handsome medieval man was just as carefully engineered, just with a different blueprint. Let's start at the top. Hair was a major deal. In most of Western Europe, noblemen wore their hair shoulder length or longer, and it was expected to be smooth, shiny, and well kept. Think of it as the nightly equivalent of a Hollywood blowout. Messy hair suggested chaos, sin, or worse, peasantry, A nobleman's hair had to say, "I have a personal servant with a comb made of ivory and time to burn." The style varied by region and era, but the themes remained the same. Hair should be controlled but full, cut to flatter the face, and preferably scented. Yes, scented. Men used oils and herbal rinses to keep their hair fragrant. Rosemary, myrtle, and bay were especially popular. Some men even steeped their hair in wine-infused herbs for extra shine. So next time you see a knight with perfect waves under his helmet, just know there's a bottle of spiced rinse waiting in his saddlebag. Facial hair was more of a fashion roller coaster. In the early medieval period, a full beard meant virility and wisdom. But by the high Middle Ages, clean-shaven faces became the ideal, especially in courtly circles. Beards were increasingly seen as old-fashioned, even barbaric. A smooth face said youth, purity, and civilized manners. That's why portraits of knights often show them fresh-faced, with maybe just the faintest suggestion of stubble, like a 5 o'clock shadow drawn on with a goose feather. But shaving wasn't easy. Razors were basic, mirrors were scarce, and shaving creams didn't exactly exist. Most men used a sharp blade and a lot of courage, sometimes aided by warm oils or animal fat to soften the skin. Wealthier men had barbers or servants do the job, turning it into a mini ritual of grooming and status. Barbers, by the way, also perform surgeries and tooth extractions, so try not to twitch. Now, onto skin. Men weren't expected to look ethereal like women, but they still had to present clear, healthy complexions, especially if they moved in noble circles. A squire with good skin was seen as trustworthy, pious, and well-bred. A man with scars, blemishes, or rashes may be cursed, maybe unclean. Maybe not the guy you want reciting poetry under your window. Did men use skincare? Absolutely. Some used herbal washes or rubbed their faces with fresh milk, rosewater, or even egg whites to keep their skin firm and clean. There are records of knights applying mixtures of crushed almonds and honey to soothe sunburns or battle irritation. And yes, just like women, some wore a touch of powder, especially if they were going bald early and needed to blend that scalp line. Who says vanity's a one-way street? Let's talk bodies. The ideal medieval man was lean, tall, and straight-backed, with long limbs and visible strength. Not overly muscled, that was for labourers, but strong in a knightly way, as if you could lift a sword and still write a sonnet afterward. Broad shoulders, long neck, narrow waist. Sound familiar? These ideals were shaped by chivalric literature, which painted the perfect man as both warrior and poet, strong but sensitive, a man who could joust and then play the lute with the same hands. And yes, there were fashion cheats. Some men padded their doublets to appear broader in the chest. Others wore tight hose and codpieces to suggest a more robust lower half, because apparently subtlety was for peasants. Hose were often custom-fitted, and the seams could be dyed to highlight muscle tone, a little theatrical, sure, but in a world where marriage alliances could turn into kingdoms, looking good was its own kind of diplomacy. Let's not skip clothing, because male fashion in the later Middle Ages got downright extravagant. We're talking pointed shoes so long they needed to be tied to your knees, sleeves so wide they doubled as snack storage, fabrics so bright and rich they made peacocks look underdressed. Noblemen flaunted their wealth with fur-lined cloaks, silk tunics, embroidered gloves, and ornate belts that served no purpose other than to glitter in torchlight. But even within all that flair, there was a logic. Your colour choices, for example, mattered. Red for passion and power, blue for loyalty, black for seriousness, gold thread meant royalty, silver accents whispered wealth, and everything you wore, especially in court, was carefully chosen to reflect your family name, your personal honour, and your place in the pecking order. And yes, there were sumptuary laws for men too. A merchant might be banned from wearing fur-lined sleeves. A minor knight couldn't wear a robe longer than ankle length. If you weren't born into the upper classes, you had to earn your fashion, or fake it discreetly and hope no one noticed. Because if you looked too good, someone might question your tax bracket. Let's not forget the perfume game, which was very real. Men often scented their gloves, their hair, even their boots. A particularly stylish nobleman might carry a sachet of herbs tied inside his tunic or wear a pomander, basically a medieval cologne bomb dangling from his belt. Some even dabbed rosewater behind the ears or carried perfumed handkerchiefs to wave around dramatically. Not extra at all. Fringe fact, some knights were so obsessed with their scent that they refused to wear armour that hadn't been aired with lavender beforehand. One French nobleman reportedly delayed a battle by 3 hours because his linen undershirt hadn't been properly scented with orange blossom. Priorities. Of course none of this was universal. In rural areas, peasants weren't brushing their hair with scented oils or ironing their hose. Their beauty standard was more about practicality, clean, strong, laying, and not dying of scurvy. But even among the lower classes, there were signs of grooming. Fresh linen, brushed hair, trimmed nails. Because even if you weren't trying to seduce a duchess, you were trying to make a good impression at the harvest festival. And yes, age mattered. Young men were expected to be fresh-faced and eager. Older men, wise, slightly wrinkled, but still well kept. A knight past his prime who let himself go was seen as pitiful. One who aged gracefully, with a clean shave and a sharp cloak, legendary. There was even a term, venerabilis formosus, meaning beautiful in old age. Basically, medieval silver fox energy. So tonight, if you're standing in front of the mirror adjusting your collar, or wondering if you should bother with aftershave, know that you're continuing a long tradition. Because in the Middle Ages, beauty wasn't just for the ladies, it was for knights, poets, lords, and every man who ever stood in a draughty hall thinking, does this tunic make me look noble? And the answer, if you played your cards right, was always yes. You've witnessed noble women whitening their faces into ghostly masterpieces, men scenting their armour with orange blossom, and lovers trading garters like magical scrolls of desire. But let's pull back the velvet curtain on one of the most striking divides in medieval beauty, the sharp, unforgiving line between peasant beauty and noble beauty. Now, no matter how many romance novels or historical dramas try to tell you otherwise, medieval Europe was not a place where a milkmaid could slap on some rosewater and strut into court undetected. Beauty was class-coded, not just in how you looked, but in how you were allowed to look. If you were born into the peasant class, your appearance wasn't just shaped by circumstance, it was shaped by law, labour, and a whole lot of sun damage. Let's begin with the basics. Access to beauty tools. A noblewoman might have an entire chest filled with grooming items. Ivory combs, imported oils, mirrors made of polished silver, scented pastes and powders with ingredients so exotic they had to be smuggled in from Constantinople. A peasant woman, her grooming kit might consist of a bone comb, a wooden basin of cold water, and maybe, a bar of lard soap shared with the entire household. But here's the thing, peasant women still had beauty rituals. They weren't just rolling around in pig pens and calling it a day. They washed their faces with river water, combed their hair with local herbs, and used natural ingredients like clay, nettles, and rosemary to care for their skin. Some even made their own lip stains from crushed berries or tinted their cheeks with red wine residue. Call it DIY, call it survival, but it was beauty on a budget long before influencers got into it. Their hair too was a badge of beauty, when they had time for it. Long hair was still the ideal, especially for unmarried girls. It was usually braided, coiled, or covered with a simple coif or kerchief. No silk veils here, just linen and hope. Hair was cleaned with water and sometimes rinsed with vinegar or chamomile to cut through grease and add a touch of shine. And while noble women could afford to avoid the sun, peasant women were in it all day. So yes, sun-bleached hair existed, but that natural blonde was paired with tanned skin, calloused hands, and a level of exhaustion that no rosewater could fix. Which brings us to the core visual divide, skin tone. We've touched on it before, but it's worth hammering home. Pale skin equals privilege, tanned or weathered skin equals labour. That wasn't just an aesthetic opinion, it was a social barcode. No matter how beautiful your features, if you were brown from the sun, society read you as a worker, a field hand, a nobleman. The noblewoman might envy your strong limbs and natural flush, but she certainly wasn't going to trade places with you. But here's the fascinating part. Peasant beauty had its own internal standards. It wasn't about looking like a lady of the court, it was about looking healthy, strong and fertile. A rounded face, a full figure, bright eyes, shiny hair, these were signs of a good worker, a good wife and a future mother. A girl who could survive winter, carry firewood and still have enough energy left to dance at the harvest feast. This kind of beauty wasn't decorative, it was functional, and people respected it for exactly what it was. And men, same deal. Peasant men weren't expected to look clean-shaven and literary, they were expected to look tough. A handsome peasant man was muscular, tanned, broad-shouldered, with strong hands and maybe a slightly crooked nose from that one time he fought off a boar. His face might not be smooth, but his reputation for hard work and good humour was its own kind of charm. Even his clothes, rough tunics, simple boots, hand-woven cloaks, had their own rugged aesthetic. Not courtly, but solid. But what if a peasant woman did want to elevate her look? Well, that's where things got complicated. She could try to mimic noble styles, plucking her brows, covering her hair more elegantly, sewing decorative trim on her sleeves, but she'd risk being mocked or worse, accused of social climbing. Remember those sumptuary laws? They didn't just apply to royalty. If you were caught wearing something above your station, you could be fined, scolded by a local priest, or branded as proud. Pride was a dangerous sin, especially for women, and trying too hard to be beautiful, especially if you were poor, was seen as a red flag. People might accuse you of vanity, dishonesty, or even witchcraft. You weren't supposed to want more than your lot in life. You were supposed to be humble, grateful, and invisible. That didn't stop some women from trying. There are plenty of anecdotes about village girls who got creative, stealing scraps of ribbon from markets, fashioning jewels out of polished stones, or bits of glass, or stitching secret initials into their aprons to catch the eye of a certain miller's son. And why not? Even if you couldn't become a noble, you could still turn heads at the midsummer fair, and for one night, under the moonlight and the music, maybe that was enough. Fringe fact: in some rural communities, there were local beauty competitions, usually tied to festivals or religious holidays. The May Queen tradition, for instance, involved crowning the most beautiful maiden in the village. Her reward? A crown of flowers, a dance with the most eligible bachelor, and the envy of every other girl for the next 6 months. So yes, beauty mattered everywhere. It just looked different depending on your station. There were also regional beauty standards, even within the lower classes. In Northern Europe, pale hair and rosy cheeks were prized. In southern regions, dark hair and olive skin were the ideal. Some villages favoured plumper women as signs of health, while others admired slim, agile frames for their endurance. These local preferences shaped everything from how women braided their hair to how they shaped their eyebrows, if they bothered plucking them at all, which, spoiler alert, most didn't. And then there were cross-class crushes. You'd better believe they happened. A nobleman might catch sight of a beautiful peasant girl at a feast or in a field and decide he simply must have her. Cue the poems, promises, and occasional scandal. These relationships were rarely equal and often tragic, but they proved that even the rigid boundaries of class couldn't always erase the raw power of physical beauty. Still, no matter how beautiful a peasant girl was, she was constantly reminded of where she belonged. She might receive the compliments, attention, or even gifts, but she was rarely invited to the banquet, let alone the altar. Her beauty was admired, desired, but rarely respected. In the eyes of the medieval elite, her attractiveness was seen as accidental, a flower growing in the wrong garden. So tonight, as you smooth on your lotion or slip into something soft, remember this. Medieval beauty was never just about the face or the figure. It was about power, position, and permission. And while noblewomen painted themselves pale and perfumed their piety, the women in the fields braided their hair, pinched their cheeks, and showed up anyway, tired, sun-warmed, barefoot, and still beautiful. Not because they were allowed to be, but because they were. You've now seen how class carved beauty into two wildly different experiences. Perfumed veils for some, sunburned necks for others. But here's the twist that really complicates things. Sometimes being beautiful meant looking like you were sick. No, seriously. In medieval Europe, the line between ideal beauty and fatal illness was as thin as a layer of lead-based face powder. Tonight, we're wading into the strange and fascinating world where pale skin, hollow cheeks, and fragile bodies weren't just tolerated, they were celebrated. Welcome to the age of the fashionably ill. Let's rewind to that old familiar favourite, paleness. You already know that pale skin was prized among the upper class as a marker of wealth, nobility, and indoor living. But what's wild is how far people were willing to take this look. Pale. Yes, but not just pale. They wanted you to look translucent, like light might pass through you. The closer you looked to someone who hadn't seen the sun in 5 years, the more divine you were presumed to be. And guess what else comes with that ghostly aesthetic? Illness. Specifically the kind of illnesses that cause the skin to look waxen, the eyes large and glassy, and the limbs delicately thin. We're talking about tuberculosis, also known as consumption. In its early stages, TB gave people a flushed cheek, bright eyes, and a slender build. Romantic poets would swoon over these traits centuries later, but the obsession began much earlier. Yes, people knew TB was deadly, but in the early and high Middle Ages, disease wasn't fully understood. It was often spiritualized or symbolized. So when a woman appeared delicately pale, with thin wrists and an absent-minded air, she wasn't necessarily feared. She might be considered ethereal, artistic, or touched by God. Her beauty became something otherworldly, something hovering just above mortality. In a weird way, she was more appealing because she looked like she might waste away at any moment. That's not to say people wanted to be sick, but there was a blurred aesthetic overlap between signs of illness and signs of beauty. Gauntness could be saintly, quietness could be virtue, and don't forget the religious factor. Fasting and extreme modesty were often praised, especially in women. A girl who refused food might be seen not as disordered, but as holy, a woman above earthly needs. Her thin frame wasn't a concern, it was a miracle. Fringe fact, St. Catherine of Siena reportedly lived for years on nothing but communion wafers and water. Her emaciated frame and sunken eyes were considered signs of divine favour. Imagine that in today's beauty influencer culture, this 14th century icon glowed from within, her secret, fasting until she passed out in church. Inspiring. Back to secular beauty, signs of delicate health were often deliberately mimicked. Women dabbed a touch of red wine on their cheeks to simulate the consumptive flush. They used belladonna to dilate their pupils, not just to look more doe-eyed, but to create that slightly feverish sparkle. The goal was not to look robust or sporty. The goal was to look like you'd just emerged from a vision, or maybe a fainting couch. This extended to body shape too. A soft, willowy figure was ideal, not muscular or energetic, but fragile, elegant, slow-moving, the kind of woman who didn't walk so much as drift. Medieval texts often describe noble women with phrases like delicate as air, pale as moonlight, and weak of constitution. These weren't insults, they were compliments. To be physically strong was to be too close to the labouring classes. True beauty meant hovering somewhere between life and dream. Even posture reflected this. The ideal woman wasn't upright and bouncy, she was gracefully slouched, often resting, reclining or leaning. In courtly love poetry, the beloved is always languishing. By the window, in the garden, in bed. She's draped in silk, listlessly playing a harp, maybe sighing dramatically. You weren't supposed to look like you could churn butter. You were supposed to look like butter would exhaust you. Of course, this aesthetic was easier to pull off if you weren't actually dying. Real illness came with side effects that didn't photograph well in illuminated manuscripts. Swelling, lesions, bad breath, lost teeth. But the idea of illness, the ghost of it, was strangely alluring. And it wasn't just women. Male poets too were praised for being pale and melancholic, especially if they had lovesickness, which was considered both romantic and deeply fashionable. Lovesickness was a real diagnosis in medieval medicine. It involved symptoms like loss of appetite, insomnia, rapid heartbeat, and sudden fits of weeping. In other words, heartbreak. But rather than being seen as weak, a man suffering from this affliction was considered refined, his soul too tender for this brutal world. Women in turn might find such a man deeply attractive, his suffering proof of depth and sensitivity. A sad boy in a velvet tunic, absolutely swoon-worthy. But the obsession with the ill aesthetic didn't stop at TB and heartbreak. There were entire fashion trends inspired by plague culture. During outbreaks, people became hyper-aware of pened appearance, especially signs of disease. Ironically, this heightened attention to decay made youthful, untouched beauty even more desirable. Yet paradoxically, appearing vaguely ill could still be trendy. There's documentation of women painting veins on their forearms or temples with blue dye to appear more translucent. That's right, fake veins were a look. Check out the realism on that fainting maiden. Is she dying or just stunning? And the teeth. Well, perfect teeth weren't really expected, but small, neat, pale-coloured teeth were admired, ideally hidden behind modest smiles, of course. If you happened to lose one due to illness or poor hygiene, there were limited ways to hide it, like small wax plugs or painted-on black dots to create symmetry. But if your illness affected your face too obviously, say pustules, scarring, or lesions, you were in trouble. Beauty flirted with illness but never let it get too real. This entire dynamic, beauty overlapping with sickness, is something scholars still debate. Some argue it was simply a byproduct of a religious piety. Others say it reflected deep fears about mortality and the body. Still others point out that the medieval mind often saw physical beauty as a mirror of the soul, and if your soul was good, then your appearance, no matter how gaunt or pale, was proof of your inner light. But maybe the truth is simpler. When life is uncertain, short and so brutal, there's something strangely comforting about romanticizing fragility. If you can't control death, you dress like you've already made peace with it. You paint your cheeks to mimic fever, you walk like you're fading into a vision, and you hope that looking like a tragic poem will protect you from becoming one. So tonight, when you look in the mirror and see colour in your cheeks or strength in your frame, celebrate it. The medieval world might have called that earthly, but we know better now. There's no need to blur the line between beautiful and barely breathing, because you don't need to look like you're dying to be divine. So far, you've applied blush made from crushed roses, faked a fever flush for love, and spent entire feasts trying not to sweat through your perfumed veil. You've mastered the delicate dance of medieval beauty, but tonight, we're opening the cabinets, peeking into the cauldrons, and getting our fingers just a little sticky. Because no medieval beauty journey would be complete without exploring the magic potions and DIY elixirs that promised everything from glowing skin to eternal youth, and maybe just a hint of demonic possession. Let's set the scene. You're in your chamber, a small window open to let in the scent of evening herbs, the soft flicker of candlelight bouncing off the mirror, polished brass, of course. Spread before you is a makeshift apothecary, dried lavender, beeswax, rosewater, powdered eggshell, a pinch of saffron filched from the kitchen, and maybe, just maybe, a drop of something your aunt's cousin swore was passed down from a Moorish healer who once cured a prince's leprosy. This is your beauty routine. Medieval cosmetics were rarely store-bought. They were crafted, simmered and whispered about, passed between women like secrets wrapped in linen. Recipes were written down in books of household knowledge, often right next to soup instructions and how to deworm a goat. Beauty wasn't a separate ritual. It was baked into daily life, stitched between survival and superstition. Let's start with skincare, or what passed for it. The most basic DIY remedy? Egg whites. Whipped and smeared over the face, they were believed to tighten skin and reduce redness. Leave it on too long and you'd walk into chapel looking like a badly frosted cake. But hey, your pores? Immaculate. Another favourite? Bread soaked in milk and rose water. You'd press the soggy mash onto your face as a calming mask. The theory was that milk softened the skin while rosewater soothed hot humours. The smell? Delightfully bougie. The feeling? Like being kissed by a bakery. 10 out of 10 would recommend, unless you're gluten intolerant, in which case maybe skip to the honey. Ah, honey, the sticky MVP of medieval beauty. It was used in masks, balms and poultices. Mixed with lemon juice, it made a decent exfoliant. Stirred with vinegar and herbs, it became a toner. Rubbed on chapped lips, instant fix. A sweet face for a sweet disposition, or so they said. Plus, it smelled better than most things in your town, which, let's be honest, included ox dung and damp wool. Fringe fact, some noble women believed that bathing in donkey milk could restore youth. Cleopatra allegedly did it. And if it was good enough for her, well, enterprising European women tried to recreate the effect using goat milk, cow milk, or whatever animal was wandering outside that day. The rich ones actually imported donkey milk for their tubs. The poor settled for water, a few herbs, and imagination. Now let's talk about hair treatments. Want silky, shiny, marriageable hair? Try boiling rosemary, lavender, and sage into a rinse. Need volume? Beat eggs into your scalp. Blonde ambitions. Soak your hair in lemon juice and sit in the sun. Of course, you would risk a tan, which, as we know, was a scandal. But sacrifice had its price, and a hint of gold in your locks could make or break your chances at courtly love. There were even potions that claimed to restore lost hair, often involving onions, mustard seeds, or garlic. Rubbed vigorously into the scalp, these tonics stung like betrayal but promised regrowth. Did they work? Maybe not, but they did clear the room, which meant fewer people to judge your thinning hairline. Moving south, let's say to your teeth, dental care was creative. Whitening your teeth meant rubbing them with burnt rosemary ash or powdered sage. breath fresheners included chewing cloves, mint leaves, or dried citrus peels. Some women even chewed on cinnamon bark, which helped with breath and added a lovely scent to their voice, or so the poets claimed. Want to keep your teeth from rotting? Good luck. But some believed rinsing with vinegar could help, and if all else failed, well, a smile with closed lips was always in vogue. But here's where things get darker, literally and magically. Some beauty remedies straddled the line between natural healing and forbidden arts. A poultice made from nightshade might help with puffiness, if you didn't use too much. Belladonna was used to dilate pupils, as we mentioned, but it was also associated with witchcraft. Mandrake root, with its eerily human shape, was said to cure warts, heal skin, and invite unwanted attention from the local clergy. It's no surprise that women who got too good at crafting these potions, especially if they didn't come from noble families, could find themselves accused of sorcery. Mixing herbs? Fine. But the moment your face looked suspiciously youthful past 30, the whispers started. She's aged not a day. Her skin glows in candlelight. She made that mole disappear. Witch. There are even surviving grimoires, books of spells that include beauty enchantments. One spell recommends writing a lover's name in wine on your chest and sleeping with rose petals under your pillow to become more attractive. Another suggests speaking a charm while plucking a single eyebrow hair under the full moon. Effective? Probably not. Mysterious enough to terrify your neighbours? Definitely. It wasn't all nonsense though. Many herbal remedies worked. Lavender calmed the skin, aloe soothed burns, cucumber reduced swelling. Medieval women weren't just throwing frog legs into cauldrons and hoping for the best. They experimented. They adapted. They shared knowledge across kitchens, convents, and apothecaries. They were chemists before chemistry, dermatologists before dermatology, beauty influencers without the Wi-Fi. And while modern science has blessed us with moisturizers that don't contain crushed snail shells or pig fat, some of those ancient practices live on. Rosewater is still a beauty staple. Honey masks are back. Herbal rinses, oil cleansing, clay facials, it's all recycled wisdom. The difference is that today you're less likely to be burned at the stake for having impossibly smooth hands. So tonight, as you soup your moisturizer from a sleek little jar, and maybe light a lavender candle because TikTok told you to, take a moment to appreciate the women who came before. The ones who plucked herbs at dusk, whispered recipes in secret, and brewed beauty from what they had, be it flower petals or superstition. They didn't have retinol or serums. They had instinct, curiosity, and a whole lot of chamomile. And somehow they made it work. Radiantly. We've mixed milk with petals, rubbed ash into our teeth, and dabbed on egg whites like it's the 1347 version of Sephora. But the medieval beauty saga doesn't end in rose-scented veils or scandalously visible ankles. No, tonight we glide into the closing chapter of this long, powdered, tightly laced tale by stepping right up to the threshold of something new. Because just as the bells of the medieval world were tolling out their final centuries, something began to shift, a changing face of beauty, literally and figuratively. Welcome to the Renaissance drift, where the tail end of the Middle Ages started turning the page. You, still dressed in layers of wool and linen, might not notice it at first. After all, you're still plucking your hairline and applying that lead paste with a prayer and a steady hand, but behind you, just behind the Gothic arches and the saints in gold leaf, comes a growing murmur. Art is changing, trade is booming, and across the Alps, in the merchant-ruled city-states of Italy, the new beauty isn't modest, veiled, or faded like parchment. She's vibrant, she's fleshy, she looks you dead in the eyes. Let's talk about the Renaissance woman, not the metaphorical one, but the actual painted lady appearing in frescoes and altarpieces from Florence to Venice. She is not medieval, her forehead may still be high, her skin still pale, but her cheeks now flush with natural blood. Her hair, still coiled and veiled perhaps, but you can see the glimmer of real texture. And most noticeably, her body is changing. No more vanishing waists and saintly silhouettes. Instead, there's fullness. Hips, breasts, arms with weight and muscle. She isn't drifting through a convent garden. She's rooted, and she's here to be seen. Why the change? A mix of things. The rediscovery of classical Greek and Roman ideals, for one, thanks to the Renaissance obsession with antiquity. Those ancient statues with curvy bodies and bold features weren't just dug up. They were idealized again, turning the soft, womanly form into a symbol of perfection. Add in the explosion of humanism, and suddenly beauty wasn't just about reflecting God, it was about reflecting man. Real, imperfect, sensual thinking man, and woman. In this new vision, beauty is no longer only a moral signal, it's celebration. Think of Botticelli's The Birth of Venus. Here's a goddess, nude, long-limbed, with golden hair flowing like silk in the sea breeze. She's not trying to hide, she's being worshipped because she's visible. Compare that to the medieval Madonna, wrapped up in veils and humility, and you start to see just how far the pendulum is swinging. Of course, these changes don't happen overnight. In many parts of Europe, especially the rural ones, the old beauty standards stick around like stubborn herbs in a winter garden. Women still veil. Skin is still powdered pale. But even among the nobility, you start to see cosmetic shifts. Rouge becomes redder. Gowns are cut lower. Hair is styled into deliberate waves, not just covered up. Mirrors become more common, and people spend more time in front of them, practicing expressions that say, I'm virtuous, I'm wealthy, or maybe just, I know what I look like. Makeup, once flirted with and feared, becomes less suspicious, though not entirely innocent. New recipes appear in household books, blending crushed pearls with herbs, using egg yolks for skin tone or developing concoctions to grow thicker lashes. Italian women begin using lead-based foundation called cerasa, mixed with vinegar for a gliding, luminous finish. Deadly? Yes. Beautiful? Absolutely. In Venice, it's said women use belladonna drops not only to dilate their pupils, but to give their eyes that misty, I'm thinking about poetry and possibly poisoning someone look. Fringe fact. During this transition, some women use live leeches placed behind their ears to suck out blood and produce a more fashionable, faint flush. The logic? Better out than in, they might say, casually bleeding themselves in the name of romance. It wasn't just beauty, it was performance art. As beauty changes, access changes too. With increased trade and growing middle classes in places like Florence, Bruges and London, people outside the noble elite begin to buy into beauty culture. Artisans' wives are using imported rose oil. Merchant daughters are copying the gown cuts of duchesses. Cosmetic recipes are shared not only through noble handbooks, but through early printed pamphlets, which start to pop up in the late 15th century. Beauty is no longer locked in towers, it's marketable. And with more people paying attention to beauty, you also get more critics. Religious reformers start wagging fingers at vanity again. Preachers declare that the devil lurks in the rouge pot, that long lashes invite sin, and that no true Christian needs scented gloves. But the world is shifting, the mirror isn't going back in the box, and women, while still bound by expectations, laws and gender norms, are discovering something novel, agency in appearance. That agency is quiet at first. It's stitched into the hem of a brighter gown, mixed into the scent of a new face balm, hinted at in the slightly lower neckline worn at a private feast. But it's growing, because even as beauty standards are still deeply entangled with status, piety and control, women are beginning to play with the rules. Some follow them, some twist them, a few outright break them. And men, oh, they're evolving too. Renaissance fashion brings puffed sleeves, bejeweled codpieces, feathered caps, and enough cologne to knock a bishop sideways. The nobleman of 1500 is no longer a clean-shaven warrior in a sombre cloak. He's a peacock in silk, painting his self-image as boldly as any artist paints a canvas. Scholars today still debate how clean the break was between medieval and Renaissance beauty. Was there really a sharp line, or just a slow melting of old ideals into new obsessions? Some argue that the Renaissance simply dressed up medieval norms in richer fabric. Others point to the explosion of portraiture, mirrors, and fashion prints as evidence that people had begun to see themselves and their beauty differently. The truth, as always, lies somewhere between the powder and the parchment. The medieval world didn't end in a single moment. It unravelled, gracefully and sometimes clumsily, into a new age of vanity, invention and self-expression. So tonight, as we step out of the Middle Ages and into this next chapter, take one final glance at the mirror. Your medieval mirror may be slightly cracked, may be polished only by candlelight. In it you see all the women who came before you, the noblewoman powdering her cheeks with rice flour, the village girl braiding her hair for the May Day feast, the perfumed courtier dabbing rosewater on her wrists before a masked ball. You see centuries of whispered recipes, silent struggles, and quietly revolutionary beauty choices. They weren't just trying to be pretty, they were trying to be seen. And now, as the final candle burns low and the echoes of embroidered slippers fade down the cold stone corridors, it's time to close the book, not just on this chapter, but on an entire era of beauty. You've wandered through powder-scented chambers and sun-drenched fields, stood beneath cathedral arches and beside bubbling pots of crushed rose petals, and met women who painted, plucked and perfumed their way through a world that rarely gave them control but always demanded their appearance. If there's one truth that lingered under every veil, behind every mirrored glance, it's this: beauty was never just about looking good. It was language, it was armour, it was pressure, rebellion, art, and sometimes pure survival. Whether you were a noblewoman dodging sumptuary laws or a village girl staining her cheeks with wine dregs, every choice whispered a story of class, of control, of power. Sometimes it was about becoming visible, sometimes it was about not being punished for being seen. And the more things change, the more those whispers echo in the present. Today's contour kits and retinol serums may be wrapped in different packaging, but the rituals, the instincts, the mirror stage dilemmas, still here, still human, still us. So as you stretch beneath the weight of blankets and centuries, take a breath. Let your body soften. Let your face forget the performance. You are not in a medieval court. You don't need to pluck your forehead or bleach your hair with goat urine. You're safe here. Just a voice in the dark, keeping you company. The bells are quiet now. The torches have dimmed. You made it through the Middle Ages, powdered, perfumed, and a little bit wiser.